Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Motorola HT750 sits on my nightstand like a sleeping spider, its display dark as the October night pressing against my bedroom windows. 37 years since tower control retired me, and I still can't bring myself to throw the damn thing away. Some nights, I convince myself it's sentiment, a keepsake from 4 decades of guiding aircraft through Newark's airspace. Other nights, when the shadows stretch longer and the house settles with sounds that don't belong, I know better. It's 3:17 a.m. when the radio awakens. The display flickers to life with that familiar amber glow, casting geometric shadows across the water-stained ceiling. No battery. I removed it years ago. No antenna either. I unscrewed that stubby black rod the day they handed me my retirement papers and told me to clear out my locker. Yet there it is, humming with impossible electricity, the frequency display cycling through numbers like a slot machine before settling on 121.5. The emergency frequency. My throat constricts. That's impossible. The radio hasn't worked since 1987, the year everything went wrong. The year Flight 847 disappeared from our screens during what should have been a routine approach to runway 22L. The year Martinez, Henderson, and Kowalski never came home from their shifts. The year I learned that some frequencies carry more than just voices. Static whispers through the speaker, soft as dried leaves scraping concrete. Then cutting through the white noise like a scalpel, comes the voice. Newark Control. This is Meridian Flight 847 requesting immediate approach vectors. The words arrive in a language I don't recognize. Syllables that feel wrong in my ears. Consonants that click and hiss like insects communicating in the dark. Yet somehow, impossibly, I understand every word. The knowledge sits in my brain like a tumor, unwelcome and unexplainable. My hand trembles as I reach for the radio. The plastic feels warm, fever warm, as if something living pulses beneath its surface. The voice repeats its request, more urgent now, accompanied by the distant whine of jet engines that seem to echo, not from the speaker, but from somewhere inside the walls themselves. Newark Control. We are low on fuel and experiencing navigation failure. Request immediate vectors for landing. The coordinates follow, a string of numbers that burn themselves into my memory with mathematical precision. But these aren't coordinates for Newark International. These numbers, when I trace them mentally across the aviation charts still burned into my brain after all these years, point to something else entirely. They point here, to my house, to this exact room. I set the radio back on the nightstand with exaggerated care, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever barrier keeps the impossible contained within its plastic shell. The voice continues its desperate litany, fuel status critical, passengers requiring immediate medical attention, weather deteriorating rapidly. Standard emergency procedures delivered in that alien tongue that my brain translates without consent. Through my bedroom window, the October sky remains clear and star-drunk. No storm clouds. No navigation beacons piercing the darkness. No aircraft running lights bleeding red and green against the night. Just silence and the steady pulse of suburban midnight, broken only by the occasional car passing on Maple Street and Mrs. Kowalski's dog yapping at shadows 3 houses down. Mrs. Kowalski. The irony isn't lost on me. Sharing a name with the controller we lost that night. Another coincidence in a life that's collected too many of them. The radio falls silent. The display dims to black. I lie back against my pillow, listening to my heart hammer against my ribs like something trapped and desperate to escape. Sleep feels impossible now, but I close my eyes anyway and try to convince myself it was just a dream. Just another nightmare spawned by guilt and too much bourbon before bed. But I know better. This isn't the first time. The transmission started 3 months ago, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always lasting exactly 13 minutes. I've timed them. I've recorded them on my phone, though the recordings never capture anything but static and my own ragged breathing. I've researched the language, spending hours in the public library scrolling through linguistics websites and UN translator forums. But the closest I've come to identification is a notation that the vowel patterns suggest a constructed language, possibly designed for aviation use. Constructed for aviation use. The phrase haunts me. I've stopped mentioning it to Dr. Brennan during our sessions. The first time I brought up the radio, he adjusted his glasses and asked if I'd been taking my medication as prescribed. The second time, he suggested we explore my unresolved trauma surrounding the 1987 incident. The third time, he recommended a sleep study and increased my dosage of trazodone. But the pills don't stop the transmissions. If anything, they make the voices clearer, more insistent. As if the medication strips away some protective layer of skepticism, leaving my mind vulnerable to frequencies it was never meant to receive. The house around me breathes with the rhythm of old wood and settling foundations. Every creak feels deliberate, every shadow pregnant with meaning. I've lived here for 15 years, bought it with my pension money and the settlement from the Federal Aviation Administration's regrettable workplace incident payout. But lately, the familiar has become foreign. Corners seem deeper. Hallways stretch longer in the darkness. Windows reflect not just my aging face, but suggestions of movement that shouldn't exist. I rise from bed and pad barefoot to the kitchen, floorboards groaning beneath my weight like the deck of a ship in rough seas. The coffee maker's digital clock reads 3:31 a.m., its blue numerals floating in the darkness like runway lights. I pour 3 fingers of Jameson into a glass and stand at the sink, looking out at my backyard. The grass needs cutting. Fall leaves carpet the lawn in orange and brown, and the old oak tree Martha planted before the cancer took her drops acorns that ping against the aluminum siding with irregular metallic notes. Normal suburban sounds, normal suburban sights. But tonight, something else lurks at the edge of perception. A pressure in the air, as if the atmosphere itself has thickened. The whiskey burns my throat, but it doesn't warm the cold spreading through my chest. Through the kitchen window, the darkness beyond my property line seems deeper than it should, more absolute, as if the world simply ends where my yard meets the vacant lot next door. I'm turning away from the window when the kitchen radio starts playing. Not the handheld Motorola upstairs. This is the old transistor radio Martha used to listen to while cooking dinner, sitting silent on the counter for the 3 years since I last changed its batteries. The display remains dark, but soft music drifts from its speakers. Not quite a waltz, not quite classical. Something in between, played on instruments I can't identify. The melody feels familiar yet wrong, like a childhood lullaby heard through water. My glass slips from numb fingers and shatters against the linoleum. Whiskey and glass fragments scatter across the floor, but I barely notice. The music continues, growing louder now, joined by what might be voices singing in harmony, or maybe screaming. The distinction blurs as the sound fills the kitchen, pressing against my eardrums until I want to cover my ears and run. Instead, I move closer to the radio. The plastic case feels warm, like the Motorola upstairs. When I touch the volume knob, static electricity jumps between my finger and the metal, and for just an instant, the music clarifies. It's not a waltz at all. It's the sound of wind rushing past aircraft wings, the rhythmic thrum of jet engines, the whistle of air through damaged fuselage, and underneath it all, voices calling for help in that same impossible language that somehow translates itself in my brain. Mayday, Mayday. This is Meridian Flight 847. We have lost cabin pressure and are experiencing rapid decompression. Request immediate emergency landing authorization. The transmission cuts off mid-sentence. Silence floods the kitchen like water rushing into a sinking ship. The radio's display remains dark. The only sound is my own breathing, harsh and quick in the sudden quiet. I back away from the counter, glass crunching under my feet. A thin line of blood trails from my heel, but I barely feel the pain. All my attention focuses on the implications spreading through my mind like infection. 2 radios, both dead for years, both receiving the same impossible signal. The cold spreads from my chest to my extremities, and I realize I'm shivering despite the house's steady 72 degrees. Something is wrong with this picture. Something fundamental has shifted in the laws that govern my small piece of reality. Back upstairs, the Motorola sits exactly where I left it. Dark and silent. Innocent. I sit on the edge of my bed and stare at it, waiting for the amber display to flicker back to life, waiting for those alien voices to resume their desperate pleas for landing clearance. Minutes pass. The digital clock beside the radio advances from 3:47 to 3:58 to 4:03 a.m. Outside my window, false dawn begins to gray the eastern horizon. Soon the sun will rise on another day in suburban New Jersey, and I'll have to decide whether what I experienced was real or just another symptom of a mind slowly unraveling under the weight of 3 decades worth of guilt. But as I watch the radio's blank display, a new thought occurs to me, a possibility that makes my skin crawl and my pulse quicken. What if they're not asking for landing clearance? What if they're asking for permission to come home? The idea sits in my brain like a splinter, impossible to dislodge. Flight 847 never crashed. The investigation concluded, aircraft and crew lost without trace. Aviation speak for, we have no idea what happened. No wreckage, no distress signals, no emergency beacon activation. One moment they were on our screens, following standard approach vectors. The next, they simply weren't. But what if they didn't disappear? What if they've been circling ever since, trapped in some impossible holding pattern, waiting for clearance that never comes? And what if the coordinates they keep transmitting, the ones that point directly to my house, aren't a mistake or a malfunction? What if they're coming here because I was the last controller to speak with them? The thought should be absurd, should trigger whatever rational part of my mind still functions, and dismiss itself as the paranoid fantasy of a traumatized old man wrestling with survivor's guilt. But instead, it feels true with the kind of bone-deep certainty that bypasses logic entirely. I was on duty that night. I was the voice in their headphones when everything went wrong. And maybe, in whatever strange space they've been trapped in for 37 years, I'm still the only voice they can hear. The Motorola's display flickers, once, twice, then steadies into that familiar amber glow. This time I don't wait for the transmission to begin. I reach for the radio with steady hands, thumb finding the transmission button with muscle memory earned across 4 decades of guiding aircraft safely home. The button clicks under the pressure of my thumb. Static hisses from the speaker, waiting for my response. Waiting for the words that will finally grant Flight 847 permission to land. But as I open my mouth to speak, I hear something that stops the words in my throat. Through my bedroom walls, impossibly distant yet growing closer, comes the sound of jet engines approaching from the west. The rumble builds steadily, accompanied by the high whine of aircraft on final approach. Landing lights pierce the false dawn, throwing shifting shadows across my bedroom ceiling. On the radio, the voice speaks one final time, and now I can hear the relief mixed with desperation in those alien syllables my brain translates without permission. Newark Control, we have visual on the runway. Thank you for guiding us home. The transmission ends. The radio goes dark. And through my window, I watch the landing lights grow brighter as something that shouldn't exist begins its final descent toward my house. The engine sound fills the world now, rattling windows and shaking foundations. Somewhere in the growing roar, I think I can hear voices. Passengers and crew expressing gratitude in that impossible language, thanking me for finally bringing them home after 37 years of waiting. I should run, should grab my keys and flee into the pre-dawn darkness, should do anything except sit here waiting for whatever impossible thing is about to land in my suburban backyard. But I don't move, can't move, because somewhere in the deepest part of my mind, a truth is crystallizing that I'm not ready to acknowledge. The landing lights grow brighter, the engine sound becomes deafening, and as the first hint of sunrise touches the eastern horizon, I close my eyes and wait to discover whether Flight 847 is finally coming home, or if I've been the one who's been lost all along. The radio remains silent on my nightstand, its display dark as the approaching dawn, but in that darkness I swear I can see the reflection of landing lights that exist only in the space between madness and memory, in the frequency where the lost call out to those who sent them there. And I realize, with perfect clarity, that some clearances should never be given. But it's too late now. The approach lights are visible through my bedroom window, dropping toward my backyard with mechanical precision. In a few moments, I'll have my answer. I just hope I'll still be sane enough to understand it. Story 2. The hypnotherapy sessions began innocently enough. Dr. Brennan's sterile office, the rhythmic tick of an antique clock, and her voice guiding me through breathing exercises meant to unlock whatever trauma had been stealing my sleep for months. I'd expected to uncover childhood fears or work-related stress. I hadn't expected to meet myself. The first dream came 3 sessions in. Not the usual fragmentary chaos of REM sleep, but something crystalline and controlled. I stood in what appeared to be my apartment, though the furniture had shifted, older, more worn, with photographs I didn't recognize lining the mantelpiece. The man sitting in my reading chair looked exactly like me, save for the silver threading through his hair and the deep lines carved around his eyes. He spoke without moving his lips, his words arriving in my mind like ripples across still water. The park bench, third oak from the fountain, tomorrow at sunset. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth and the certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of my reality. The next evening found me wandering through Meridian Park despite every rational instinct screaming against it. The autumn air carried the sharp scent of dying leaves and something else, something like ozone before a storm. I located the third oak easily. Its gnarled branches cast twisted shadows that seemed to writhe independently of the wind. The bench beneath it appeared ordinary enough, weathered green metal with municipal stenciling that had faded to illegibility. But there, wedged between the slats, was a piece of paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, recognizing my own careful cursive script before my mind could process the impossibility of what I was seeing. The date at the top read 30 years from today. The content made my vision swim. You dreamed of the apartment again. The older furniture, the photographs you don't remember taking. You heard my voice without sound. This is how it begins. This is how it always begins. You must pay attention to what I show you next. The event approaches, and I can only guide you through echoes across time. Trust what you see in sleep. Trust what you find in waking. The pattern is everything. Below this, written in what appeared to be different ink, was a single word that made my blood freeze. Soon. I read the note 17 times before the implications fully settled into my consciousness like sediment in disturbed water. The handwriting analysis would prove inconclusive. I was no expert, but every loop and angle matched my own style with unsettling precision. The paper itself felt ordinary, though I detected a faint chemical smell that reminded me of darkroom developing solutions. Sleep that night brought another lucid encounter. This time, the older version of myself stood in what I recognized as the park, though the landscape had changed. The fountain had been replaced by a memorial of some kind, black granite reflecting nothing. The trees bore no leaves, their branches reaching skyward like desperate fingers. When he turned to face me, I noticed his eyes held a haunted quality that made my chest tighten. 3 days. His mental voice carried urgency now. The pattern accelerates. You'll find proof tomorrow. Building 47, 3rd floor, behind the loose brick. What you discover will terrify you, but you must act on it. The event cannot happen again. What event? I tried to ask, but he was already fading, leaving only the acrid smell of smoke and the echo of distant screaming. I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with perspiration that smelled wrong, metallic and sharp. Outside my window, the digital clock on the bank across the street flickered erratically, displaying times that couldn't exist. 25:73, 91:42, 00 repeating endlessly. Building 47 stood at the corner of 5th and Morrison, a decrepit office complex scheduled for demolition. Getting inside required creativity and a concerning disregard for my own safety, but the 3rd floor proved accessible through a fire escape that the building's current state of disrepair had rendered permanently extended. The loose brick took 40 minutes to locate, hidden behind a water-stained section of wall that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth that cracked at my touch, was a manila envelope. Inside, newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes spanning what appeared to be decades, all in my handwriting, all dated in the future. The photographs showed scenes I'd never witnessed but somehow recognized. The park fountain cracked and empty, Main Street lined with emergency vehicles, crowds of people with expressions of profound terror looking skyward at something the camera couldn't capture. The newspaper headlines spoke of an event, always referred to simply as the event, that had fundamentally altered the city. The articles were vague, mentioning only unprecedented atmospheric disturbances and mass psychological episodes that had left hundreds hospitalized. But it was the handwritten notes that made my vision blur and my hands shake uncontrollably. They formed a correspondence across time, my future self documenting attempts to prevent whatever was coming, and my present self, or rather, various past versions of my present self, responding to guidance that this evidence proved I'd been receiving for years. One entry, dated 6 months ago, described in perfect detail the exact hypnotherapy session that had triggered my first lucid dream. Another, from 3 years ago, contained blueprints of my current apartment, with notations about optimal placement for reception enhancement. A third, written in shaking cursive, described failed attempts to warn people directly and the necessity of working through temporal echoes instead. The final note, dated just 2 days from now, consisted of a single paragraph that made my throat close. It begins at 3:17 p.m. The sky will change first. Look for the color that doesn't exist. You cannot stop it, but you can minimize the damage. Evacuate the fountain area. The children's hospital must be cleared by 3 gauss. Do not attempt to explain. Do not let them see you near the site afterward. This is the 23rd iteration. Each time I remember a little more. Each time you have the chance to save a few more. The pattern must continue until we find the source. I spent the next day in a state that felt like controlled drowning, moving through familiar spaces that now seemed contaminated by impossibility. My reflection in mirrors appeared slightly delayed, as if the image needed time to catch up with reality. Shadows fell at wrong angles. The clock in my kitchen ran backward for 17 minutes before resuming normal time. Dr. Brennan's office felt like sanctuary until I noticed the family photograph on her desk had changed. The little girl in the striped dress now faced away from the camera, her posture suggesting she was looking at something beyond the frame's edge. When I mentioned this, Dr. Brennan's expression shifted in a way that made my skin crawl. She knew. Somehow she knew about the dreams, the notes, the impossible correspondence across time. Her questions during our session had taken on a probing quality that felt less like therapy and more like interrogation. She asked repeatedly about my temporal displacement experiences and whether I'd noticed any causal loop manifestations in my daily life. I left without finishing the session, but not before seeing the manila folder on her desk labeled with my name and a date 6 months in the future. That night's dream took place in an office I'd never seen but recognized immediately, Dr. Brennan's space, though transformed. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be mathematical equations. At the center of it all sat the older version of myself. But he was different now, older still, with scars across his hands that looked like burn marks, and eyes that held knowledge too terrible to process. Tomorrow, his mental voice carried exhaustion that seemed to span decades. But this time, you're not alone. She's been guiding others too, people like us, people who can receive the echoes. We've tried direct intervention 22 times. Tomorrow we try something different. Tomorrow, we let it happen but control the variables. The children's hospital is empty. The fountain area is cordoned off for construction. The event will occur, but its impact will be contained. What is the event? I demanded, surprised to find I could project thoughts back to him. For the first time, he smiled, though it was an expression that contained no joy. You'll understand in 43 years. Until then, just remember, the pattern is not a prison. It's an opportunity. Each iteration teaches us more about the source. Each time we save a few more people. Each time we get closer to preventing it entirely. But what if this is just madness? What if none of this is real? His laugh resonated like broken glass. Does it matter? Mad or sane, people will be safer tomorrow because you found those notes. Mad or sane, you'll check the fountain area at 3:17. Mad or sane, you'll see the color that doesn't exist, and know that some patterns transcend the boundaries of time and reason. I woke to find my bedroom filled with the sound of ticking, not from any clock I owned, but from somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the building, as if the entire city had become a vast clockwork mechanism, counting down to something inevitable. The final note appeared under my door while I made coffee that morning. Same handwriting, but the paper was different, older, yellowed at the edges as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. The message was brief. 3:17 p.m. today, fountain area, Meridian Park. Don't try to stop it. Don't run. Just watch. And when you see the impossible thing, remember that you have 43 years to figure out how to prevent it. The children are safe. The hospital is empty. Today we minimize the damage. Next time, we might eliminate it entirely. Welcome to the pattern, past self. Try not to go insane. We need you functional for what comes next. P.S. Dr. Brennan has been dead for 6 months. Check tomorrow's newspaper. The woman you've been seeing was part of the event's influence, preparing you for today. Trust nothing. Question everything. The echoes are all that remain real. Outside my window, the bank's digital clock has started displaying today's date, but 30 years in the future. As I watch, the numbers begin to shift, counting down. 47 years, 46 years, 45 years. In 6 hours, I will walk to Meridian Park. I will stand near the fountain and watch the sky change to a color that shouldn't exist. I will witness something that will define the rest of my life and echo backward through time to ensure this moment arrives exactly as it must. And 43 years from now, if the pattern holds, I will sit in a chair in an apartment I don't yet own, projecting thoughts across decades to a younger version of myself who stands terrified in a park, watching reality fracture like glass. The clock outside continues its countdown. 44 years, 43 years, 42 years. I can hear ticking in the walls now, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a fountain that doesn't yet know it's about to break. Story 3. The brass nameplate still gleamed despite decades of neglect. Professor Edgar Whitmore, Entomological Studies. I traced my finger along its edge, feeling the same mixture of pride and unease that had followed me since inheriting my grandfather's property 3 months ago. The farmhouse sat isolated on 40 acres of overgrown meadow, its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of Virginia creeper and thyme. But it was the study that truly belonged to him, a shrine to his life's obsession with preserving the delicate architecture of insects. Glass display cases lined every wall from floor to ceiling, each one containing specimens mounted with surgical precision. The air hung thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something sweet and chemical that caught in the back of my throat like mothballs mixed with formaldehyde. I'd planned to sell everything, of course. The real estate agent had been enthusiastic about the land value, though she'd wrinkled her nose when we'd entered the study. But something kept me from making that call, some gravitational pull I couldn't quite name. Instead, I found myself spending hours among the cases, studying my grandfather's meticulous labels written in his spidery handwriting. Lepidoptera noctuidae, Coloptera scarabaeidae, Diptera culiscidae. The routine established itself without conscious decision. I'd wake at sunrise, make coffee in the kitchen with its chipped porcelain sink and ancient refrigerator that hummed like a dying wasp. Then I'd walk the property, checking the old barn where grandfather had kept his equipment, the mounting boards, the killing jars, the delicate forceps that looked more surgical than scientific. By afternoon, I'd return to the study, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't articulate. That's when I first noticed the patterns. The cases would be nearly empty during daylight hours, as if the specimens had simply evaporated. At first, I assumed my eyes were playing tricks. The stress of the move, the isolation, the weight of sorting through a lifetime of accumulated memories. But each morning brought the same phenomenon, where dozens of carefully pinned beetles and moths had been displayed the night before. Only empty corkboards and vacant pins remained. Yet by evening, they would return. I began keeping a notebook, documenting the daily cycles with the same obsessive precision my grandfather had applied to his collecting. Monday, morning. Case number 7, Lepidoptera, approximately 80% vacant. Evening, full restoration observed. Tuesday, morning. Cases number 3, number 7, number 12 showing significant depletion. Evening, complete specimens returned to original positions. The logical explanations crumbled under scrutiny. Temperature fluctuations wouldn't cause such systematic disappearances. Humidity couldn't make pinned specimens vanish entirely, only to reappear hours later in identical positions. I checked for gaps in the case seals, for evidence of theft or practical jokes, but found nothing. The house remained locked. The security system my grandfather had installed still functioned perfectly, and the nearest neighbor lived 6 miles away. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in grandfather's old bedroom on the 2nd floor, listening to the house settle around me like an organism breathing. The floorboards would creak with what sounded like footsteps, though I told myself it was just the old wood expanding and contracting. Through the thin walls, I could hear sounds from the study below, faint rustling, like tissue paper being carefully handled, or the whisper of tiny wings against glass. 3 weeks after arriving, I decided to keep watch. I positioned myself in the leather chair grandfather had favored, angling it to provide a clear view of the cases while remaining partially hidden behind his massive oak desk. The grandfather clock in the corner, another of his collections, ticked steadily toward midnight, its pendulum catching occasional glints of moonlight from the tall windows. At 11:47 p.m., the first movement caught my peripheral vision. Case number 7, the one containing his prized moth collection, began to shimmer. Not the entire case, just the specimens themselves, as if viewed through heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The pinned wings fluttered once, twice, and then something impossible happened. They lifted from their pins. One by one, the moths detached themselves from the cork backing with movements so fluid they seemed to flow rather than fly. Their bodies retained the rigidity of preservation, their wings the papery translucence of death. Yet they moved with purposeful intelligence. They gathered near the glass front of their case, creating patterns that shifted and reformed like a kaleidoscope of decay. My hands gripped the chair arms as similar stirrings began in the other cases. Beetles rolled from their pins and landed with barely audible clicks on the glass shelves. Dragonflies unfolded wings that had been spread and mounted decades ago, their compound eyes catching available light like clusters of tiny mirrors. Even the smaller specimens, flies, gnats, mosquitoes, separated themselves from their displays and began to move in coordinated spirals. The rational part of my mind screamed explanations. Hallucination brought on by stress, carbon monoxide poisoning from the old furnace, some kind of neurological episode triggered by isolation. But my body knew what it was seeing. Every muscle tensed with primal recognition of something fundamentally wrong with the natural order. The specimens began to organize themselves. They moved in formations that suggested intelligence, purpose, even hierarchy. The larger beetles formed perimeter groups while the flying insects created aerial patterns above them. They seemed to be sorting themselves, preparing for something. Then I felt it, a sensation like spider silk being drawn across my face, though nothing touched me. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost tactile, and with it came a sound just below the threshold of hearing. Not quite humming, not quite buzzing, but something that resonated in my bones rather than my ears. That's when they turned toward me. As one, every revived specimen oriented in my direction, hundreds of preserved eyes fixed on my hiding place behind the desk. The sound intensified, and I realized it wasn't coming from the insects themselves, but from the air around them, as if their movement was somehow generating harmonics in the atmosphere. I wanted to run, but my legs felt leaden, my vision tunneling as adrenaline flooded my system. Instead, I remained frozen as the collections began to move toward me, not aggressively, but with the measured pace of a formal procession. The first beetle reached the edge of my chair. It climbed the leather with movements that were simultaneously mechanical and organic, its legs clicking against the material in a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. Others followed, creating streams of preserved life that flowed up the chair arms and across the desk. When the first one touched my skin, I nearly bolted. Its feet were cold, impossibly light, but undeniably real. More followed, creating paths across my arms, my chest, my neck. They moved with careful precision, never hurrying, never causing pain, but mapping my body with methodical thoroughness. Through the peripheral haze of panic, I became aware of another sound, clicking, tapping, like Morse code transmitted through fingernails on wood. Looking toward its source, I saw them, the fireflies. Grandfather's collection of Photinus piralis occupied a specialized case near the window, one equipped with black light to showcase their bioluminescent properties. Now they were free, their preserved abdomens pulsing with ghostly green illumination that cast shifting shadows across the walls. But these weren't random patterns. The shadows had shape, purpose, meaning. As my eyes adjusted to the strange light show, I realized the shadows were forming recognizable silhouettes, tiny humanoid figures engaged in what looked like domestic activities. Some appeared to be hanging miniature laundry on lines strung between the furniture legs. Others worked in groups, carrying objects I couldn't identify toward the corners of the room where grandfather's folded clothes sat on storage benches. The insects on my body had paused their exploration, as if waiting for some signal. The firefly shadows continued their pantomime, and gradually I understood what I was witnessing. A reenactment of daily life, performed by creatures that should have been long dead, using my possessions as props for their ghostly theater. One shadow figure, slightly larger than the others, appeared to be examining something in its hands. As the firefly casting it moved closer, I could make out more detail. The shadow was holding what looked like a small, round object. A button. My button, I realized, reaching instinctively for my shirt collar. The top button was missing, leaving a loose thread that I couldn't remember pulling. The shadow figure seemed to notice my movement. It turned in my direction, and though shadows have no eyes, I felt distinctly observed. The other figures paused their activities, creating a tableau of frozen attention that made my skin crawl beneath the weight of the real insects still exploring my body. Then the shadow figures began to move again, but their activities had changed. Instead of domestic pantomime, they were now engaged in what looked like preparation. They worked in pairs, some appearing to measure invisible objects while others seemed to be constructing something from materials I couldn't see. The organization was meticulous, purposeful, and utterly wrong. A sharp pain in my scalp made me flinch. One of the specimens, a particularly large beetle, had somehow managed to grasp a single hair and was tugging it with surprising strength. Before I could react, the hair came free with a sensation like a tiny needle being withdrawn. The beetle carried its prize away, joining a procession of insects that were methodically collecting samples. A thread from my shirt, a small flake of skin from my hand, another hair from my arm. The implications crashed over me like cold water. They weren't just exploring or performing for my benefit. They were harvesting, gathering materials with the same systematic approach my grandfather had used when preparing his specimens. Each piece carefully selected, each sample cataloged and stored according to some incomprehensible taxonomy. I thought of grandfather's notebooks, filled with detailed preparation procedures, the careful removal of internal structures, the replacement of organic materials with preservatives, the precise positioning of each specimen to create the illusion of life within the confines of death. Was that what this was? Some kind of cosmic justice, the collected taking their revenge on the collector? But as I watched the shadow figures continue their preparations, arranging their invisible tools and materials with practiced efficiency, I realized something more disturbing. This wasn't revenge. This was continuation. They were simply following procedures they had learned through observation, carrying on the work that had defined this house for decades. The morning light began to seep through the windows, pale and gray. As it did, The insects on my body began their retreat, flowing back toward their cases with the same orderly precision they had shown in approaching. The fireflies' glow faded as natural light took precedence, and their shadow theater dissolved into ordinary darkness. Within minutes, the study appeared exactly as it had the evening before, every specimen in its proper place, every case sealed and undisturbed. If not for the missing button and the phantom ache where my hair had been pulled, I might have convinced myself it had been an elaborate dream. But as I stood on unsteady legs and surveyed the restored collection, I noticed something new. An empty mounting board in case number 7, positioned prominently in the center. A small placard had been placed beside it, written in grandfather's familiar handwriting, though I was certain it hadn't been there before. The label read, Homo sapiens, adult male, specimen number 1, collection in progress. I backed away from the case, my hands shaking as I checked my shirt collar again. The missing button left a small gap that felt enormous, a breach in my integrity that these creatures had identified and exploited. How many more pieces would they need? How long did their preparation process take? Outside, the morning birds were beginning their chorus, a sound so normal and wholesome it seemed to mock the impossibility of what I had witnessed. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee with hands that wouldn't quite steady, trying to convince myself that stress and isolation had finally triggered some kind of breakdown. But when I returned to check the study an hour later, it was empty again. Every case depleted, every specimen vanished to wherever they spent their daylight hours. And on the mounting board designated for specimen number 1, a single object had appeared. My missing button, pinned carefully to the cork with one of grandfather's delicate mounting pins. The coffee cup slipped from my hands, shattering on the hardwood floor in a spray of ceramic and caffeine. As I knelt to clean up the mess, I felt something tickle the back of my neck, a sensation like tiny feet exploring the boundary between collar and skin. When I reached up to brush it away, my fingers came back holding a single black hair. Not one of mine. This was coarser, older, gray at the root, the kind of hair my grandfather had possessed in his later years. I looked up at the empty cases surrounding me, their glass fronts reflecting my pale face back at me in fragments. Somewhere in the walls, the house made a sound like quiet breathing, like patient waiting, like the whisper of wings preparing for flight. The mounting board waited, empty except for my button, but I understood now that it wouldn't stay empty forever. The collection was incomplete, and my grandfather's pupils were nothing if not thorough in their work. I should leave. I should pack my belongings, call the real estate agent, and never return to this place where the natural order had been so fundamentally disturbed that death itself had become merely another state of organization. But as I stood among the empty cases, feeling the weight of invisible eyes upon me, I found myself wondering, what would it feel like to be properly preserved? To become part of something larger and more permanent than the fragile, temporary existence I had always known? The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden light. In a few hours, darkness would return, and with it, the collection would stir to life once more. They would continue their work with the patience that only the dead can possess, preparing their newest acquisition with the same meticulous care my grandfather had shown his thousands of specimens. I touched the gap where my button had been, feeling the loose thread that marked their progress. Tomorrow they might take another hair, or perhaps a small piece of skin. Each sample carefully preserved, catalogued, and stored until the preparation was complete. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, I felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time in years, I belonged to something. I had purpose, meaning, a place in an organization that transcended the petty concerns of the living. As the shadows began to lengthen across the study floor, I settled back into grandfather's chair and waited for the collection to wake. After all, good specimens require patience to prepare properly. Story 4. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was static electricity. 3 weeks into my new job as night security at the abandoned Meadowbrook Telephone Exchange, I'd grown accustomed to the building's peculiar sounds, the settling groans of 70-year-old timber, the whistle of wind through broken window seals, the occasional ping of cooling metal from the old switching equipment. What I hadn't expected was the sensation that something was actively fighting against my presence there. The building had been shuttered since 1987, when digital systems finally made the massive mechanical switching apparatus obsolete. Row upon row of towering relay cabinets filled the main floor, their copper veins still threaded through the walls like the nervous system of some dormant giant. My employer, Hartwell Property Management, had acquired the building cheap with plans to convert it into loft apartments, but renovation kept getting delayed. Environmental surveys, permit issues, contractor disputes, something always went wrong. In the meantime, they needed someone to keep vagrants and vandals out. The money was decent for what seemed like easy work. 12-hour shifts, 4 nights a week, walking the perimeter every few hours and spending the rest of my time in the small security office they'd set up in what used to be the main operator's station. The office was cramped, but functional, with a desk, a few monitors showing feeds from the exterior cameras, and most importantly, good lighting. That's where the problem started. The overhead fluorescents had burned out years ago, leaving only a single desk lamp, an old brass fixture with a 100-watt incandescent bulb that cast everything in warm, golden light. I'd grown comfortable with its glow during those first weeks, using it to read or work on crossword puzzles between my rounds. But then came that Tuesday night in October when everything changed. I'd been reviewing some maintenance reports when I felt it. A sudden, scorching impact across my shoulder blades, as if someone had slapped me with a red-hot poker. The pain was so intense, I actually cried out, spinning around in my chair to see who was behind me. The office was empty, of course. I was 3 stories up, the door was locked, and I was alone. Pulling off my shirt in the small bathroom adjacent to the office, I discovered 5 distinct red marks across my back, roughly where fingers might land if someone had reached out and struck me. The marks were perfectly spaced, perfectly symmetrical, and they burned like fresh brands. I splashed cold water on them, trying to think rationally. Maybe I'd backed into something sharp. Maybe the old chair had some protruding metal that had heated up somehow. But I knew, even as I tried to rationalize it, that no chair could have made those marks. The marks faded over the next few days, but they returned the following Tuesday night, and the Tuesday after that. Always the same time, around 2:17 a.m. Always the same intensity, the same burning sensation, the same 5 perfect welts. I started timing my rounds to avoid being in the office during those crucial minutes, but the attacks followed me wherever I went in the building. It didn't matter if I was in the lobby, the basement, or up on the 4th floor. When that moment came, the pain would find me. It was during the 4th week that I noticed the pattern. The burning only occurred when I was using bright lights. The desk lamp, a flashlight, even my phone's LED when turned to maximum brightness. In dimmer lighting, I was safe. I began conducting my rounds by moonlight whenever possible, using only the faintest illumination necessary to navigate the building's maze of equipment and cables. But avoiding light entirely wasn't practical. I needed to complete my logs, review security footage, handle the basic administrative tasks that came with the job. So I started experimenting, testing different levels of brightness to find the threshold. The office's desk lamp had a dimmer switch, which I began adjusting with the careful precision of a safe cracker. 20% brightness, no problems. 30%, still safe. 40%, a slight tingling sensation across my shoulders. 50%, the tingling became a warm pressure. 60%, definite discomfort. 70%, the burning began. I settled into a routine of keeping the light at exactly 45% power, bright enough to work but dim enough to avoid triggering whatever was happening to me. For nearly a week, this system worked. I felt proud of myself for solving the problem through logical analysis. I was adapting, overcoming, taking control of my situation. That's when I decided to install the camera. I'd been carrying around an old trail camera from my hunting days, one equipped with infrared sensors for night photography. If something was actually striking me, if this wasn't just some bizarre medical condition or psychological breakdown, then maybe I could capture evidence. I mounted the camera in the corner of the office, angled to cover the area behind my desk, and spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon testing different settings and positions. The following Tuesday, I sat at my desk with the camera recording, the lamp dimmed to its safe setting, and waited. 2:17 a.m. came and went without incident. I felt both relieved and disappointed. Maybe the camera's presence had somehow disrupted whatever force was affecting me. Maybe the psychological comfort of knowing I was documenting everything had been enough to break the cycle. But I was wrong. The attacks resumed the following week, and the week after that. The camera captured nothing, just me, sitting alone at my desk, occasionally wincing and reaching for my back. Watching the footage was deeply unsettling. The pain was real, the marks were real, but from the camera's perspective, I might as well have been slapping myself. It was Dr. Reeves, my physician, who suggested stress-related phantom pain. I'd finally worked up the courage to see someone about the marks, though I hadn't mentioned the supernatural aspects of my situation. He examined the welts during one of my visits, noted their unusual symmetry, and recommended reducing caffeine and getting more sleep. He also wrote me a prescription for a mild anti-anxiety medication. The pills helped me sleep, but they didn't stop the attacks. If anything, the drowsiness made them worse. I'd become so sensitized to the sensation that even the anticipation of it could trigger phantom burning. Some nights I'd feel the pain building minutes before it actually struck, like atmospheric pressure dropping before a storm. That's when I started pushing the boundaries. If something was reacting to my use of light, then I wanted to see exactly what that something was. I began incrementally increasing the lamp's brightness during my Tuesday vigils, documenting everything with meticulous notes. At 60% power, the burning intensified but remained bearable. At 70%, it felt like acid on my skin. At 80%, I could barely remain conscious. But it was at 90% that I saw it. I'd cranked the dimmer almost to its maximum setting, gritting my teeth against the agony that immediately flared across my back when I noticed something in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the lamp, but shadows don't move independently of their light sources. This did. In the space behind my chair, roughly at shoulder height, something was taking shape. Not solid, but not entirely ethereal either, like smoke given structure or darkness made manifest. As the burning on my back intensified, the shadow became more defined, resolving into the unmistakable outline of an arm and hand. The limb was wrong in every conceivable way. Too long, too thin, with joints that bent at impossible angles. The fingers were skeletal, ending in what looked like blackened nails or claws. Most disturbing of all was its state of decay. Even as a shadow, I could see places where flesh had rotted away, revealing gaps and holes that suggested advanced decomposition. The hand hovered inches from my back, perfectly positioned to match the burning marks I'd been receiving for weeks. As I watched in horrified fascination, the fingers slowly curled, as if preparing to strike. I killed the light. The office plunged into darkness, and immediately the burning sensation faded. When I turned my phone's flashlight toward the space behind my chair, nothing was there. Just empty air and the familiar outline of filing cabinets against the far wall. My hands shook as I wrote up my report for that night. Part of me wanted to believe I'd hallucinated the entire thing, a stress-induced vision brought on by pain and sleep deprivation. But the marks on my back told a different story. 5 fresh welts, exactly matching the position and spacing of the shadow hand's fingers. I should have quit then. Any rational person would have walked away, found a normal security job at a shopping mall or office building, and never looked back. But I couldn't let it go. The scientist in me, the part of my brain that had earned a degree in electrical engineering before circumstances forced me into security work, needed to understand what was happening. Over the following weeks, I conducted a series of carefully controlled experiments. I mapped the exact positions where the shadow appeared, measured the timing of its manifestations, and documented the relationship between light intensity and the entity's visibility. The pattern was consistent. At 90% brightness or higher, the arm would materialize. At 85%, I could just make out its outline. Below 80%, nothing. But the most unsettling discovery came when I started using the infrared camera in conjunction with the bright lighting. Infrared sensors detect heat signatures invisible to the human eye, and what they revealed defied everything I thought I knew about the building. The shadow arm wasn't just visible, it was warm. On the camera's thermal display, the spectral limb appeared as a distinct heat signature, roughly matching human body temperature. But while a living person's arm would show consistent thermal patterns, this one was patchy and irregular, with cold spots that corresponded to the areas of apparent decay I'd observed. It was as if I was looking at the thermal ghost of something that had once been alive. The footage was compelling, but it raised more questions than it answered. If this was truly a supernatural entity, why did it only appear under specific lighting conditions? If it was a psychological phenomenon, how could it generate measurable heat signatures and leave physical marks on my body? I began researching the building's history, scouring newspaper archives and county records for any mention of accidents or unusual incidents. The Meadowbrook Exchange had operated for nearly 60 years without any documented fatalities, though I did find scattered reports of workers complaining about equipment malfunctions and unexplained power fluctuations. One article from 1984 caught my attention. Telephone workers report strange incidents at local exchange. The piece was brief and dismissive, treating the workers' concerns as urban legend, but it mentioned several technicians who claimed to have been touched by unseen hands while working late shifts. The incidents had reportedly increased during the building's final years of operation, contributing to high employee turnover and eventual closure. The article included a quote from a former night supervisor named Margaret Chen. "There's something in that building that doesn't want to be disturbed. The harder we worked to fix the old equipment, the worse it got. It was like the building itself was fighting back." I tried to track down Margaret Chen, but she died in 2019. However, I did manage to contact her daughter, who agreed to meet me for coffee. Sarah Chen Martinez was a soft-spoken woman in her 40s who remembered her mother's stories about the telephone exchange. Her mother had worked there for 15 years, she told me, starting as a young operator and eventually becoming night supervisor. According to Sarah, Margaret had always been skeptical of supernatural explanations, but the incidents at the exchange had genuinely disturbed her. She said the old switching equipment had a mind of its own, Sarah explained. Circuits would activate for no reason, connections would form between lines that weren't supposed to be linked. But the worst part was the feeling of being watched. Mom said it felt like someone was standing right behind you, close enough to touch, but when you turned around, nobody was there. The description sent chills down my spine. It matched my own experiences too closely to be coincidence. "Did she ever mention anything about lights?" I asked. "About bright lighting making things worse?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Actually, yes. She said the problems were always worse during the day shift, when all the work lights were on. The night operators learned to work in dimmer conditions whenever possible. Mom thought it was because the electrical systems were overloaded, but..." She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "But what?" She said it felt like something was hiding in the shadows, and the brighter the lights got, the angrier it became. That conversation changed everything for me. I was no longer dealing with an isolated phenomenon. I was experiencing something that had been tormenting workers for decades. The entity, whatever it was, had a long history with the building and its electrical systems. But understanding the history didn't make my situation any less dangerous. If anything, the attacks were becoming more frequent and intense. The Tuesday night pattern had expanded to include other nights of the week, and the threshold for triggering the entity's attention had dropped from 90% brightness to 75%. I started bringing a small lamp from home, one with a lower wattage bulb, hoping to find a safe middle ground between functional lighting and supernatural assault. But even with reduced illumination, I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger. The air in the office felt thicker, more oppressive. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that didn't quite belong. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in November. I'd been working on some routine paperwork when the building's emergency lighting system suddenly activated. Motion sensors in the stairwells had triggered, bathing the entire structure in harsh fluorescent light. The brilliance was far beyond anything I'd experienced before, easily equivalent to full daylight. The attack was immediate and overwhelming. The burning sensation across my back intensified to levels I didn't think were possible, accompanied by what felt like claws digging into my flesh. I screamed and fell forward across my desk, knocking over the lamp and sending papers scattering across the floor. But this time, I didn't just feel the entity. I heard it. A low, rasping sound filled the office, like air being forced through damaged lungs. It wasn't quite a voice, but it carried unmistakable intelligence and malevolence. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the walls and floor as if the building itself was trying to speak. I fumbled for the emergency lighting controls, my vision blurred by tears of pain. The switches were located in a panel near the door, and I crawled toward them on hands and knees while the rasping continued behind me. Each breath the entity took seemed to sink with fresh waves of burning across my back. When I finally killed the emergency lights, the silence was deafening. The rasping stopped. The burning faded to a dull ache. I lay on the floor for several minutes, catching my breath and waiting for my heart rate to return to normal. But when I finally stood up and turned around, the office wasn't empty anymore. In the dim glow of my overturned desk lamp, I could see the outline of a figure standing in the corner. Not the partial arm I'd grown accustomed to, but an entire human silhouette. Tall, thin, and unnaturally still. I couldn't make out details in the low light, but I could feel its attention focused entirely on me. We stared at each other for what felt like hours. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled the room with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was what had been tormenting me for months. This was the source of the burning hands, the shadow arm, the malevolent intelligence that seemed to inhabit the building's electrical systems. And now it was showing itself completely. I don't remember making the decision to approach it. One moment I was standing by the light controls, the next I was walking slowly toward the corner, my footsteps echoing in the darkness. The figure remained motionless as I drew closer, though I could feel its awareness of my every movement. At arm's length, I stopped. The figure was definitely human in shape, but wrong in fundamental ways that my brain struggled to process. It was too tall, too thin, with proportions that suggested severe malnutrition or wasting disease. What I had initially taken for clothing appeared to be shadows clinging to desiccated flesh. Most disturbing were its eyes, or rather, the absence of them. Where a face should have been, there were only dark hollows that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But despite the lack of visible features, I could feel those empty sockets tracking my movements with predatory intensity. I reached out toward it, driven by some compulsion I didn't understand. My fingers passed through empty air where solid flesh should have been, but I felt a sensation like touching ice-cold water. The figure didn't react to my touch, but the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. That's when I noticed my breath was visible in the sudden cold, and that's when the figure spoke, not with words, but with images that appeared directly in my mind. I saw the telephone exchange as it had been decades ago, filled with workers in period clothing hunched over massive switching boards. I saw late nights and long shifts, the gradual replacement of human operators with mechanical systems, the slow death of an industry. But I also saw something else. Hidden among the legitimate workers was another figure, the same tall, thin silhouette that now stood before me. It moved through the facility like a shadow, always present but never quite visible, feeding on the electrical energy that powered the building's systems. As the exchange modernized and eventually closed, the entity had been left behind, trapped within the building's bones, sustained by whatever residual power flowed through its abandoned circuits. For years, it had existed in a dormant state, waiting for someone to bring light back to its domain. My arrival had awakened it. The images faded, leaving me standing alone in the cold office. The figure was gone, vanished as silently as it had appeared. But I knew it hadn't left. Not really. It was still there, woven into the building's electrical infrastructure, waiting for the next time I dared to illuminate its hiding places. I finished my shift in complete darkness, using only my phone's lowest brightness setting to navigate the building. The attacks didn't resume that night, but I could feel the entity's presence everywhere I went. It was watching, evaluating, perhaps deciding what to do with the human who had finally seen it completely. When my relief arrived at 6 a.m., I submitted my resignation on the spot. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that my connection to the entity hasn't been severed. Sometimes, when I'm working late at my new job, a completely normal security position at a modern office complex, I feel that familiar tingling across my shoulders. Nothing painful, nothing dramatic, just a gentle reminder that some things follow you regardless of where you go. The marks on my back have faded to faint white scars, barely visible unless you know where to look. But late at night, when I'm alone under bright lights, I swear I can still feel those skeletal fingers hovering just inches from my skin, waiting. And I've started to wonder if what I experienced at the Meadowbrook Exchange was really an encounter with something supernatural, or if prolonged isolation and stress had finally pushed my mind past its breaking point. The thermal camera footage could be explained by equipment malfunction. The historical accounts might have been embellished urban legends. Even my own experiences could be dismissed as elaborate hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation and anxiety. But then I remember the cold, the way my breath became visible in that corner office, the way the figure's presence seemed to drain warmth from the very air around it. Hallucinations can't change the ambient temperature of a room, can they? Story 5. The heat shimmers rose from the tarmac like ghostly fingers, distorting everything beyond the control tower's reinforced windows. I'd been watching them dance for the past 6 hours, my shift bleeding into overtime as the afternoon temperature climbed past 120. In the high desert of Nevada, summer afternoons could break both machines and men, and today felt particularly merciless. The air conditioning unit wheezed behind me, struggling against the relentless sun that turned our small regional airport into a furnace. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway, the bitter liquid somehow grounding me in the routine of monitoring an empty sky. Barstow Municipal wasn't exactly LAX. Most days we saw maybe a dozen flights, private jets carrying executives between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, the occasional cargo run, flight training from the nearby academy. But today had been different. Today had been silent. I adjusted my headset for the 100th time, the foam padding damp with sweat despite the air conditioning. The radar screen painted its eternal green sweep across my vision, empty save for the occasional bird return that flickered and vanished. Ground frequency crackled with static, punctuated by the distant murmur of the maintenance crew taking shelter in whatever shade they could find. That's when I first heard it. The voice emerged from the static like something surfacing from deep water, professional and crisp, despite the interference. Barstow Tower, Ghost 77 requesting taxi clearance for departure, runway 27. I straightened in my chair, scanning the airfield through the windows. Nothing moved on the tarmac except heat waves. My radar screen remained empty, the green sweep revealing only the permanent echoes of our ground equipment. I keyed my microphone. Ghost 77, Barstow Tower. I don't show you on radar or visually. Please verify your position. Static answered me, then that voice again, unchanged. Barstow Tower, Ghost 77 holding short runway 27, requesting takeoff clearance. A chill ran down my spine despite the oppressive heat. I checked my equipment readings. Everything showed normal. The radar was functioning perfectly, the radio clear except for the usual desert interference. I craned my neck to peer down at runway 27's threshold. Empty asphalt stretched away into the wavering distance. Ghost 77, I have no aircraft in sight. Please verify your call sign and position. Silence stretched for nearly a minute, filled only by the labored breathing of the air conditioning and my own heartbeat. Then, clear as day. Barstow Tower, Ghost 77. Ready for takeoff. The professional in me took over. I pulled out the logbook, checking scheduled departures. No Ghost 77. No aircraft scheduled for the next 2 hours. I tried raising the unknown caller again, but met only static. Whoever had been transmitting had gone silent. I was still puzzling over the incident when Southwest 1847 checked in 15 minutes later, a regular passenger run from Phoenix to Burbank making a routine fuel stop. Captain Martinez had been flying this route for years, and his voice carried the relaxed confidence of 10,000 hours in the cockpit. Barstow Tower, Southwest 1847 on final approach, runway 27. Southwest 1847 Barstow Tower, cleared to land runway 27, winds calm, altimeter 3008. The Boeing 737 touched down smoothly, its reverse thrusters echoing across the empty desert. I guided them to the fuel depot, went through the routine of coordinating ground services, and 40 minutes later, cleared them for departure from the same runway. Southwest 1847 Barstow Tower, cleared for takeoff runway 27. What happened next would replay in my mind for weeks. The Boeing began its takeoff roll normally, engines spooling up to full power, speed building steadily down the center line. But as it approached the point where it should have rotated, right around the runway numbers, something went wrong. Captain Martinez's voice crackled through the radio, professional calm barely masking alarm. Tower, Southwest 1847 aborting takeoff. We're experiencing unusual aerodynamic conditions. The big jet decelerated hard, smoke rising from its brakes as it came to a stop just past the numbers. My heart hammered as I coordinated emergency vehicles, but Martinez declined assistance. 20 minutes later, after what he described as a thorough pre-flight inspection, they tried again from the opposite end of the runway. This time, they departed without incident. The incident report I filed that evening felt inadequate, clinical language failing to capture the wrongness I'd felt watching that aircraft struggle against invisible forces. I attributed it to wind shear, though the weather station showed calm conditions. Desert thermal effects, I wrote, knowing it didn't fully explain what I'd witnessed. I didn't mention the phantom transmission. Not yet. The next hot afternoon brought Ghost 77 back. Same voice, same professional tone, same impossible request. This time I was ready, my hand already reaching for the phone to call my supervisor when United 573 checked in for approach. Another routine stop, another experienced crew. I guided them through their ground stop, coordinated fuel service, and 40 minutes later, found myself clearing them for takeoff from runway 27. The pattern repeated with terrifying precision. The jet began its roll, reached the runway numbers, and suddenly lost lift. This time the abort was more dramatic. Captain Stevens later described it as hitting an invisible wall, his aircraft suddenly behaving as if the air had turned to molasses. They stopped just past the threshold, emergency vehicles screaming across the tarmac. After an hour of inspections revealed nothing wrong with the aircraft, they departed from the opposite runway without problems. That night I called in sick, claiming heat exhaustion. I spent the evening on my apartment balcony, watching storms build over the distant mountains, trying to convince myself I was experiencing some kind of breakdown. Air traffic controllers weren't immune to stress reactions, and the isolation of desert postings could play tricks on anyone's mind. But when I returned 2 days later, the maintenance chief pulled me aside. 3 different flight crews had reported unusual conditions on runway 27 over the past week, always during the hottest part of the afternoon, always near the numbers. The FAA was sending an inspector next month, but for now they wanted the runway checked after each incident. I didn't tell him about the phantom calls. I was beginning to think I was the only one hearing them. The heat wave continued, each day pushing temperatures higher. The phantom voice came daily now, always requesting takeoff clearance, always from the same position. I stopped responding, but that didn't stop the real aircraft from encountering problems. Word spread quickly among the crews. Avoid Barstow's 27 during extreme heat conditions. Some pilots started requesting the shorter crosswind runway, despite the performance penalty. I began researching the airport's history during my off hours, digging through old records in the county library. Barstow Municipal had been built in the 1960s, On land that had once been part of a World War II training facility, hundreds of young pilots had learned to fly in the desert's unforgiving conditions, and not all of them had survived the experience. The accident reports made for grim reading. Training flights lost to spatial disorientation, aircraft pushing beyond their limits in the thin, hot air. One report from August 1943 particularly caught my attention. A P-51 Mustang had crashed during takeoff from what was now runway 27. The pilot, Second Lieutenant James Crawford, had been attempting his first solo cross-country flight. The aircraft had inexplicably lost power just after rotation, stalling 50 feet off the ground. Crawford had survived, but just barely. The accident report noted severe injuries and permanent grounding from flight status. The cause was listed as probable carburetor icing, though investigators admitted the conditions made ice formation unlikely. I found myself staring at Crawford's photograph, a young man with serious eyes beneath his flight cap. Something about his expression unsettled me, a haunted quality that seemed to reach across 8 decades. I checked the date of his accident, August 15th, 1943. The date hit me like cold water. August 15th. Today's date. I drove to the airport that evening, using my keycard to access the tower after hours. The building felt different in the darkness, shadows pooling in corners that seemed too deep. I climbed to the control room and sat in my familiar chair, staring out at runway 27, illuminated by scattered lights. The radio crackled softly with distant transmissions, pilots checking in with Los Angeles Center, cargo flights crossing the continent. Normal sounds that should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like whispers from another world. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the frequency cleared. And then, Barstow Tower, Ghost 77 requesting taxi clearance for departure, runway 27. This time, I keyed my microphone. Ghost 77, state your intentions. Barstow Tower, requesting takeoff clearance. I need to complete this flight. The voice was different now, younger, desperate. Not the professional pilot I'd been hearing, but something raw and pleading. My hands trembled as I gripped the microphone. Ghost 77, what is your destination? Static stretched for long seconds. Then, barely audible, home. I just want to go home. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of understanding settle on my shoulders like a shroud. Ghost 77, I'm showing no traffic on runway 27. You are cleared for takeoff. Silence answered me, complete and profound. When I opened my eyes, the runway lights seemed dimmer, as if something had passed between them and my vision. The radar screen showed nothing but ground clutter. The radio offered only the distant murmur of normal traffic. But somehow I knew the phantom calls would stop. I filed my resignation the next morning, citing personal reasons. The official story would blame the unusual incidents on a combination of extreme heat and unique thermal conditions affecting that particular runway section. The FAA inspector would find nothing wrong with the facility, though he'd recommend additional wind shear detection equipment. 6 months later, I took a position with Portland Approach Control, where the most supernatural thing I encounter is the occasional UFO report from airline pilots who've had too much coffee. The Pacific Northwest suits me. Cool temperatures, frequent rain, mountains that stay properly earthbound. But sometimes, on particularly hot summer days, when the air shimmers with familiar intensity, I catch myself listening to the radio with more attention than necessary, waiting for a voice that shouldn't be there, from someone who just wants to complete a flight that ended before it began. I never found out what happened to Lieutenant Crawford after his accident. The records simply note his medical discharge and disappearance into civilian life. But I like to think that wherever he went, he finally made it home. Some journeys, I've learned, take longer than others to complete. The new controller at Barstow tells me the incidents on runway 27 have stopped completely. She mentions this during our chance meeting at an aviation conference, noting it as one of those inexplicable things that make air traffic control interesting. I nod and change the subject, but that night I dream of heat shimmer and phantom voices, of young pilots trying to touch the sky with machines that barely understand the concept of flight. I wake with the taste of desert dust in my mouth and the certainty that some echoes never truly fade. They just wait for the right conditions to be heard again. Story 6. The brass needle quivered again last Tuesday, spinning past every measurement on the cracked face before settling into impossible territory. Uncle Theodore's barometer had been broken for 15 years, ever since the stroke took him. Yet here it was, defying physics with the same stubborn determination he'd shown in life. I stood in my living room, coffee growing cold in my hand, watching the antique instrument perform its inexplicable dance. The mahogany case gleamed dully in the morning light filtering through gauze curtains, its Victorian craftsmanship a stark contrast to my sparse, modern apartment. Theodore had left it to me in his will, along with a cryptic note about family weather patterns that I dismissed as the ramblings of a dying man. The needle continued its erratic journey, clicking against the glass face with tiny metallic taps that seemed to echo in the silence. Then, as if summoned by some invisible hand, condensation began forming inside the case, spelling out words in shaky, uneven letters. Storm coming. Secure the bloodline. My rational mind immediately cataloged explanations. Humidity changes, temperature fluctuations, perhaps a leak in the old case allowing moisture to seep in and create patterns that my stressed brain interpreted as words. I'd been working 60-hour weeks at the accounting firm, surviving on caffeine and ambition, pushing toward a partnership that demanded everything and gave little in return. Hallucinations weren't uncommon among the chronically sleep-deprived. Yet the words remained, stubbornly refusing to fade or reshape themselves into meaningless droplets. I approached the barometer slowly, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The brass felt cold under my fingertips, colder than the ambient temperature should have allowed. The condensation inside the case seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, forming new letters as the old ones dissolved. Blood knows blood. Weather is coming. The coffee mug slipped from my grasp, shattering against the floor in an explosion of ceramic and lukewarm liquid. The sound jolted me back to present awareness, and when I looked up, the barometer's face showed nothing but normal condensation patterns, meaningless and random. I spent the morning cleaning up coffee and ceramic shards, telling myself that stress manifested in countless ways. People saw faces in clouds, messages in static, patterns where none existed. The human brain craved meaning, especially when exhausted and overworked. Theodore's barometer was just an old instrument with a broken mechanism, nothing more. But that afternoon, my sister Elena called. "Marcus, something strange happened to Mom last night." Elena's voice carried that particular tension she reserved for family crises. She says it rained inside her bedroom, but only over her bed. The ceiling is completely dry, no leaks, no water damage anywhere else. The paramedics found her sitting in a puddle, soaked through, but the floor around the bed was bone dry. The words hit me like ice water. I sank into my desk chair, the phone suddenly heavy in my hand. "What do you mean, rained inside?" Exactly what I said. She's at St. Mary's now for observation. They think it might be some kind of neurological episode. But Marcus, her sheets were drenched. Her nightgown was dripping. The nurses had to wring water out of her pillowcase. Through my office window, I could see clear blue skies stretching endlessly over the city. Not a cloud anywhere. What did the doctors say? They're running tests. Blood work, brain scans, the whole battery. Dr. Hoffman thinks it might be connected to early-stage dementia, that she dumped water on herself and forgot about it immediately. But the amount of water... Elena's voice trailed off. "Marcus, there was enough water to fill a bathtub. Where would she have gotten that much water? And why would she do such a thing?" After the call ended, I found myself standing before the barometer again, studying its impassive face. The needle had returned to its normal position, pointing to fair weather with mechanical precision. No mysterious messages. No impossible movements. Just an old, broken instrument hanging on my wall. That night, I dreamed of Theodore. He stood in his old workshop, surrounded by the weather instruments he'd collected over decades of amateur meteorology. Barometers, hygrometers, wind vanes and rain gauges cluttered every surface, their brass and copper surfaces gleaming in lamplight. In the dream, Theodore looked exactly as he had before the stroke, his weathered hands steady as they adjusted delicate mechanisms. "The family has always been sensitive to pressure changes," he said without turning around, his voice carrying that familiar Kentucky drawl. "Not atmospheric pressure, mind you. Something deeper. Something that runs in the blood." I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but found myself mute in the way of dreams. Theodore finally turned, his pale blue eyes meeting mine with unsettling intensity. "Weather's coming, Marcus. Can you feel it building? The barometer never lies, not about the things that matter. Storm's been gathering for generations, and now it's ready to break." He gestured toward the instrument on my wall, somehow visible in his workshop despite being physically located in my apartment. "I calibrated it special before I passed. It doesn't measure rain or wind or temperature. It measures the pressure in our bloodline, the weight of what's coming down on us." I woke with my heart hammering against my ribs, sheets soaked with perspiration. The apartment felt stifling, airless, as if all the oxygen had been slowly drawn out while I slept. I stumbled to the window and threw it open, gasping in the cool night air. The barometer's needle was spinning again. This time, I watched from start to finish as it completed impossible rotations, defying the mechanical limitations of its broken mechanism. The needle spun clockwise, then counterclockwise, then settled pointing to a position that didn't exist on the original scale. New words appeared in the condensation, clearer than before. "Second wave building. Warn the others." I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Elena. "Marcus, it's 3 a.m. Has anything strange happened to you? Anything like what happened to Mom?" A long pause. Then, "Why are you asking me that?" "Elena, please. Just answer the question." Yes, actually. But it's impossible. Yesterday at work, it started snowing inside my office, just over my desk. Nowhere else in the building, just a small area, maybe 3 feet across. My computer got soaked. My papers were covered in slush, but my coworkers' desks stayed completely dry. The phone slipped in my sweaty palm. "What did you tell people?" What could I tell them? I said there must be a leak somewhere, that ice had formed in the air conditioning ducts. But Marcus, the maintenance crew, checked everything twice. No leaks, no explanation. And the snow, it wasn't cold. It was warm, almost body temperature, melting as soon as it touched anything. After Elena hung up, I sat in darkness, watching the barometer continue its impossible performance. The needle moved with deliberate precision now, no longer erratic but purposeful, as if controlled by an intelligence that understood exactly what it wanted to communicate. The condensation shifted, forming new words. Theodore's workshop, basement level, before sunrise. I knew the address. Theodore's old house had been sitting empty since his death, tied up in probate disputes between distant relatives. The city had been threatening to condemn it for code violations, but legal complications kept delaying the process. I'd driven past it occasionally, watching it deteriorate with each passing season. Now I found myself pulling on clothes in the pre-dawn darkness, keys in hand, moving with the strange compulsion of sleepwalking. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, cataloging all the reasons this was dangerous, foolish, potentially criminal. Breaking into private property to follow the instructions of a broken weather instrument ranked high on any list of questionable life choices. But the barometer's needle continued its hypnotic movements, and somewhere beneath my conscious thoughts, I felt the weight of something vast pressing down on me, demanding acknowledgement. Theodore's house crouched on a dead-end street like a wounded animal, its Victorian gingerbread trim sagging under years of neglect. Paint peeled from its clapboard siding in long, skin-like strips, and several windows had been boarded over with plywood that bore the stains of multiple rainstorms. The front porch tilted at an angle that suggested imminent collapse. I circled to the back, where Theodore's workshop entrance descended below ground level, accessible through what had once been coal cellar doors. The padlock that secured them looked new, but the hasp it connected had rusted through, leaving barely enough metal to hold the screws in place. A gentle tug freed it entirely, The stairs descended into absolute darkness, each step groaning under my weight with sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn silence. The air grew thicker as I descended, heavy with the scent of old wood and metal oxidation. My phone's flashlight carved a narrow cone of visibility through the gloom, revealing glimpses of the workshop Theodore had mentioned in my dream. Weather instruments covered every available surface, just as I'd seen them. But these weren't the pristine devices of my dreams. 15 years of abandonment had left them tarnished and dust-covered, their brass surfaces green with verdigris, their glass faces cracked or missing entirely. Cobwebs stretched between them like gray lace, and the whole space felt like a tomb dedicated to atmospheric science. At the center of the workshop, on a heavy oak table, sat another barometer. This one was larger than the instrument in my apartment, its mahogany case elaborately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The brass mechanism visible behind its glass face was far more complex than any barometer I'd ever seen, featuring multiple needles, subsidiary dials, and what appeared to be a small pendulum suspended in the center. Unlike its cousin in my living room, this instrument hummed with obvious functionality, its needles moving in slow, synchronized patterns. As I approached, words began forming in the condensation on its face, appearing letter by letter as if written by an invisible finger. Family pressure differential reaching critical threshold. Generational storm system approaching maximum intensity. Bloodline weather pattern entering terminal phase. The clinical terminology felt wrong, too technical for whatever intelligence controlled these instruments. I reached toward the glass, then jerked my hand back as the surface suddenly blazed with heat. More words appeared, faster now. Theodore understood. 3 generations of buildup. Father to son to grandson. Each generation adds pressure. Each generation pushes the system closer to breaking point. You are the culmination. Culmination of what? I whispered to the empty workshop. The weather that only affects blood. The rain that falls only inside. The snow that melts warm. The wind that blows through closed doors. Your family has been charged like a battery, storing something that demands release. The pendulum in the center of the instrument began swinging more rapidly, its arc growing wider with each oscillation. The subsidiary dials spun like compass needles seeking magnetic north, their movements creating a soft chittering sound that filled the workshop. It started with your great-grandfather, the first Theodore. He opened something he shouldn't have opened, made contact with something that shouldn't be contacted. The debt passes down through blood, gathering interest. I backed away from the table, my phone's light shaking in my trembling hand. The logical part of my mind insisted that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, that stress and sleep deprivation had finally pushed me past the breaking point into full delusion. People didn't receive supernatural messages through antique weather instruments. Dead uncles didn't communicate through barometric pressure. Family curses were the stuff of horror movies, not real life. But the rain in my mother's bedroom had been real. The snow in Elena's office had been real. And now, as I stood in Theodore's abandoned workshop, I could feel something shifting in the air around me, a pressure change that had nothing to do with atmospheric conditions. The storm is here, appeared on the barometer's face. It's been building for 70 years, and now it breaks. On you, through you, because of you. The workshop began to tremble, not with any earthquake or external force, but with the same vibration I'd felt when standing too close to high-voltage power lines. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin like invisible water. The barometer's needles spun wildly now, their movements creating a mechanical symphony that rose in pitch and intensity. I turned and ran for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time in my desperation to reach the surface. Behind me, the workshop filled with sounds I couldn't identify. The crack of glass, the groan of metal under stress, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of the house. I burst through the cellar doors into the gray pre-dawn light, gasping air that tasted thin and insufficient after the thick atmosphere below. As I stumbled toward my car, I could hear the sounds from the workshop growing louder, more insistent, as if something vast were stirring to life in the depths of Theodore's forgotten laboratory. The drive home passed in a blur of empty streets and flickering streetlights. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me, but the road remained empty. My apartment building looked exactly as I'd left it. Windows dark, parking lot peaceful, everything normal and mundane and reassuringly ordinary. The barometer in my living room was quiet when I entered, its needle pointing steadily to fair weather, as if nothing had happened. No mysterious condensation, no impossible movements, just an old broken instrument hanging on my wall, innocent and silent. I made coffee with hands that barely shook, telling myself that I'd experienced some kind of waking nightmare brought on by stress and suggestion. People had strange experiences in old buildings. Tricks of light and shadow could create convincing illusions. The mind was surprisingly adept at manufacturing supernatural explanations for perfectly mundane phenomena. But as the sun rose and painted my apartment in warm, normal light, I found myself watching the barometer with the intensity of a man expecting execution. Because somewhere deep in my chest, beneath conscious thought and rational explanation, I could feel it building. The pressure, the weight of whatever had been gathering in my bloodline for 3 generations, pressing down like a storm front that existed only for me, only for people who shared my particular genetic inheritance. I could feel it in my pulse, in the rhythm of my breathing, in the way shadows seemed to move just slightly out of sync with their sources. And I knew, with the certainty that comes only in moments of absolute terror, that the weather was about to change. Not outside, inside, in the space between heartbeats, in the gap between thought and action, in the secret places where blood remembers what the mind chooses to forget. The storm that had been building for 70 years was finally ready to break. I just didn't know if I was strong enough to survive it. The barometer's needle began to move again, so slowly that I almost missed it, creeping past fair weather toward territory that existed beyond measurement, beyond understanding, beyond the normal world where weather was something that happened outside your windows. In the blood, Theodore had said, and now I finally understood what he meant. Story 7. The first thing you notice about silence at 3,000 feet is that it isn't silent at all. Wind becomes a living thing up there, pressing against the glider's canopy with fingers that seem almost deliberate, almost conscious. I should have recognized that sound for what it was. Not wind at all, but breathing. I'd booked the tourist flight on impulse, drawn by the vintage charm of Clearwater Air Club's weathered hangar and the promise of seeing the valley from a perspective reserved for birds and the occasional lunatic. The instructor, a weathered man named Henderson, whose hands bore the permanent stains of aviation fuel, had strapped me into the rear seat of the ancient Schweitzer with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. "First time up?" he'd asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The pre-flight briefing had been routine. Emergency procedures, what to expect during launch, the basic physics of riding thermals like invisible elevators in the sky. What Henderson hadn't mentioned was the club's history, the shadows that seemed to linger in the corners of the hangar despite the afternoon sun streaming through dirty windows. I would learn about those later, when it was far too late to matter. The winch launch felt like being shot from a cannon, the sudden acceleration pressing me back into the worn fabric seat as the ground fell away in a rush of geometric patterns, roads becoming lines, houses shrinking to dollhouse proportions, the familiar world transforming into something alien and vast. At 3,000 feet, Henderson released us from the tow cable, and we entered that peculiar realm where gravity becomes negotiable and the earth curves away in all directions like a promise of infinite space. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded according to the laws of physics and common sense. Henderson explained the basics of soaring flight, how we rode columns of rising air like aquatic creatures navigating underwater currents. The glider responded to his touch with fluid grace, banking into thermals with wings that seemed to know secrets about the wind that human beings had spent centuries trying to understand. It was during a particularly steep turn, when the horizon tilted at an impossible angle, and my stomach performed its own private physics experiment, that I first felt the wrongness. A pressure against my harness, as if someone had grabbed the straps and pulled with deliberate force. Henderson didn't seem to notice. His attention focused on the instruments clustered before him like mechanical flowers blooming in the cramped cockpit. "Thermal's getting weak," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "We'll head north, see if we can find some lift over the ridge." But I wasn't listening anymore. Through the bubble of acrylic that enclosed us like a transparent cocoon, I had seen something that shouldn't exist. A human head floating parallel to our starboard wing, suspended in open air 3,000 feet above the valley floor. The face belonged to a man, perhaps 40, with wind-tossed hair and eyes that held an expression of profound amusement. He wore what appeared to be the remnants of military fatigues, olive-drab fabric that fluttered in the slipstream like broken wings. Most disturbing of all was his smile, not the expression of someone experiencing terror or surprise at finding himself inexplicably airborne, but the knowing grin of someone who had been expecting me. Our eyes met through the canopy, and he raised one gloved hand to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, swallowed by the turbulent air that surrounded us like an invisible ocean. "Did you see?" I began, but Henderson interrupted. "Little bumpy through here," he said, adjusting something on the control panel. "Mountain wave can get pretty rough this time of day." I pressed my face against the acrylic, scanning the empty sky for any trace of what I had witnessed. Below us, the valley spread out in afternoon shadows and patches of cultivated green, a landscape so normal and peaceful that my mind began its immediate work of rationalization. Altitude sickness, perhaps. The disorientation of my first flight in a glider. A cloud formation that my brain had interpreted as something more familiar and infinitely more impossible. But the rational explanations felt thin as tissue paper, inadequate to contain the memory of those amused eyes and that knowing smile. The figure had possessed a weight and presence that no hallucination should manage, a reality that seemed to mock the very notion of impossibility. The remainder of the flight passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Henderson continued his running commentary on thermal dynamics and the geography of the valley below, while I nodded at appropriate intervals and fought the growing conviction that we were not alone in the sky. Several times I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that didn't correspond to any cloud, a disturbance in the air that suggested presence without revealing its source. The landing approach brought its own terrors. As Henderson maneuvered us into the pattern, I found myself staring at the approaching runway with the horrible certainty that something was wrong with the aircraft itself. The control surfaces seemed sluggish, responding to Henderson's inputs with a fractional delay that suggested resistance, as if invisible hands were interfering with our descent. "She's flying heavy today," Henderson muttered, confirming my fears. "Must be something wrong with the trim." We touched down with more force than grace, the glider bouncing once before settling onto the grass strip with a series of small impacts that felt like accusations. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, I became aware of sounds I hadn't noticed during flight. Small metallic groans from the fuselage, the whisper of air moving over surfaces that should have been still. Henderson popped the canopy, and the sudden intrusion of unfiltered sound and smell, cut grass, aviation fuel, the distant hum of highway traffic, felt like awakening from a dream that had been too vivid for comfort. "Nice flight," he said, beginning the routine of post-flight inspection. "Hope you enjoyed it." I climbed out on unsteady legs, my body remembering the sensation of weight as gravity reasserted its authority. Henderson was already walking around the glider, his trained eye checking for any signs of damage or wear that might affect the next flight. It was Henderson who found them. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, crouching beside the fuselage near the cockpit. "Look at this." I joined him beside the aircraft, following his gaze to a series of parallel scratches that ran along the white gel coat like claw marks. The scratches were fresh, their edges sharp and unweathered, as if they had been made during our flight by something with nails or talons dragged across the surface with considerable force. "Could be bird strikes," Henderson said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe a hawk got a little too close during one of those thermals." But even as he spoke, we both knew that bird strikes didn't leave marks like these. Too deliberate, too evenly spaced, too much like the scratches a desperate man might make while trying to hold on to something that was slipping away from him. Henderson's inspection continued toward the tail of the aircraft, and it was there, tangled in the struts of the landing gear like some piece of mechanical detritus, that we found the tag. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a scrap of canvas and metal, the kind of equipment tag that might have fallen from any number of sources. But as Henderson worked it free from the gear assembly, its significance became unmistakable. The tag was military issue, designed to be attached to parachute equipment or other gear requiring identification. The printing was faded but legible, the block letters spelling out a name, rank, and serial number that meant nothing to me but everything to Henderson. What stopped us both cold was the date stamped in the lower corner, November 15th, 1974. "This shouldn't be here," Henderson said, holding the tag between thumb and forefinger as if it might burn him. "This shouldn't exist." His reaction suggested knowledge he wasn't sharing, a history that connected this piece of fabric and metal to something larger and more disturbing than a simple equipment malfunction. When I pressed him for details, Henderson's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "There was an accident," he said finally. "Long time ago. A paratrooper using our facilities for a civilian jump. Equipment failure." The way he said equipment failure made it clear that this was the official explanation, not necessarily the true one. I waited for more details, but Henderson was already moving away from the glider, his inspection complete, and his mood darkened by whatever memories the tag had awakened. That evening, alone in my hotel room with the valley lights scattered below my window like fallen stars, I found myself unable to dismiss what I had experienced. The rational mind rebels against evidence that contradicts its fundamental assumptions about reality, but the memory of that floating figure refused to be categorized as hallucination or mistake. The scratches on the fuselage and the impossibly old equipment tag provided a kind of external validation that made denial increasingly difficult. I spent hours researching the Clearwater Air Club online, following digital threads that led to newspaper archives and military records that had been digitized and uploaded by historical societies with too much time and too little funding. What I found there did nothing to restore my faith in the predictable nature of the world. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, 82nd Airborne Division, had died during a civilian parachute jump at Clearwater Air Club on November 15, 1974. The official report cited equipment failure, a main chute that failed to deploy, and a reserve that became tangled during the attempted emergency deployment. Torres had fallen 3,000 feet into the valley below. His body never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The newspaper accounts from the time contained details that the military report had omitted. Witnesses described seeing Torres apparently struggling with someone or something during his descent, his arms flailing not with the panic of a man whose chute had failed, but with the desperation of someone fighting against an invisible opponent. Several observers reported that Torres appeared to be trying to grab onto something that wasn't there, his fingers clawing at empty air, as if attempting to arrest his fall through sheer force of will. Most disturbing were the accounts from other skydivers who had jumped that day. 3 separate witnesses described seeing Torres suddenly veer away from his planned descent path, as if he had been pulled or pushed by forces that defied both gravity and aerodynamics. One veteran jumper with over 1,000 successful descents swore that Torres's trajectory had actually bent upward for several seconds, as if he had been lifted by invisible hands before being released to continue his fatal fall. The searches for Torres's body had continued for weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of valley floor with teams of volunteers and professional rescue personnel. They found pieces of his equipment scattered across a wide area, fragments of parachute silk caught in tree branches, pieces of his reserve chute found miles from where they should have been according to wind patterns and ballistic calculations. But Torres himself had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened to swallow him, or the sky had claimed him for its own. Reading these accounts by the flickering light of my laptop screen, I felt the comfortable boundaries of reality beginning to flex and warp. The figure I had seen during my flight bore an unmistakable resemblance to the photographs of Staff Sergeant Torres that accompanied the newspaper articles. The same angular features, the same military bearing, the same eyes that seemed to hold knowledge of things beyond ordinary human experience. Sleep that night brought dreams of falling through endless sky, of reaching out for handholds that dissolved at the touch. of voices calling from heights that no living person should be able to reach. I woke several times to the sound of wind against my hotel window, though the night was still, and the trees outside stood motionless in the moonlight. The next morning found me back at the air club, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. Henderson was there, performing routine maintenance on the same glider I had flown the day before. He looked up as I approached, his expression guarded and unwelcoming. "Thought you might be back," he said without preamble. "They usually come back." They? People who see things. People who experience things they can't explain. Henderson set down his tools and studied me with the practiced eye of someone who had conducted this conversation before. "You're not the first, you know. Won't be the last." I told him about my research, about the newspaper articles and the military records, about Staff Sergeant Torres and his impossible fall. Henderson listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail I revealed. "Torres was a good man," he said when I finished. "Experienced jumper, careful about his equipment. What happened to him? It wasn't natural." "What do you mean?" Henderson looked around the hangar as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned closer. "There have been incidents over the years. Pilots reporting figures in the sky where no figures should be. Skydivers who swear they've been touched or grabbed during descent. Equipment failures that make no sense according to the laws of physics." "And you think it's Torres?" "I think there are things about this place, about what happened here, that we don't understand. Things that don't follow the rules we think govern the world." Henderson picked up his tools again, a signal that the conversation was approaching its end. "Some people who come here, people who are sensitive to certain kinds of phenomena, they experience things, usually just once, usually just enough to make them question what they thought they knew about reality." I left the air club that afternoon with more questions than answers, but with the growing certainty that what I had experienced during my flight was neither hallucination nor mistake. The world, it seemed, contained spaces where the normal rules became negotiable, where the past refused to remain buried, where the dead continued to move through familiar skies with purposes known only to themselves. Months have passed since that flight, and I have tried to return to the comfortable assumptions that governed my life before I saw Staff Sergeant Torres floating beside our wing at 3,000 feet. But the memory persists, as vivid and undeniable as a scar, and with it comes the knowledge that I have been marked by an experience that exists outside the boundaries of rational explanation. Sometimes, late at night when the wind picks up and rattles the windows of my apartment, I find myself listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. The whisper of fabric against air, the soft rush of someone moving through spaces where movement should be impossible. And sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, I catch what might be the sound of breathing, patient and deliberate, as if someone is waiting just beyond the reach of sight for a moment when the barriers between worlds grow thin enough to cross. I no longer book flights on small aircraft. I avoid high places where the wind might carry voices from altitudes that the living aren't meant to reach. But I know, with the certainty that comes from having touched the impossible, that Staff Sergeant Torres is still up there, still falling through endless sky, still reaching for something that exists just beyond his grasp. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I wonder if what he's reaching for is not salvation or rest, but company. Other souls to join him in his eternal descent through skies that belong neither to the living nor the dead, but to something else entirely. The equipment tag sits in my desk drawer now, wrapped in tissue paper like a relic. I've never shown it to anyone else, never tried to have it analyzed or authenticated. Some truths are too dangerous to verify, too fragile to withstand the harsh light of scientific scrutiny. But on quiet nights, when the world feels too solid and predictable, I take it out and hold it in my palm, feeling the weight of decades and the persistent presence of mysteries that refuse to be solved. The wind outside my window changes pitch, and for just a moment, it sounds almost like laughter. Story 8. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when I first saw him. A figure hunched against the weather, clutching a newspaper over his silver hair like some makeshift shield. He stood at the edge of Meridian Square, hesitating before the crosswalk, his thin frame trembling with each gust of wind that sent the downpour sideways across the pavement. I was hurrying home from work, my umbrella cutting through the deluge, when something made me stop. Maybe it was the way he stood there, so utterly defeated by the storm. Or maybe it was the memory of my own grandfather, who used to tell me that kindness was the only currency that never lost its value. Whatever the reason, I found myself approaching him. "Here," I called out over the drumming of rain on concrete. "Take this." He turned, and I saw eyes the color of storm clouds, set deep in a face mapped with lines that spoke of decades weathering far worse than rain. For a moment, he seemed to look through me rather than at me, as if I were some mirage conjured by the weather. Then his expression softened into something resembling gratitude. "Very kind of you," he said, accepting the umbrella with hands that shook slightly. Whether from cold or age, I couldn't tell. His voice carried an accent I couldn't place, something European, but worn smooth by time. "We'll see each other when it stops raining." There was something in the way he said it, a certainty that made the words feel less like pleasantry and more like prophecy. But I was already soaked through, and the promise of dry clothes and hot coffee pulled me toward home. I gave him a quick nod and sprinted across the square, using my briefcase as a poor substitute for the umbrella I'd just given away. By the time I reached my apartment building, my clothes clung to my skin like a second unwelcome layer. I climbed the stairs to my third-floor unit, leaving a trail of water drops that would surely earn me another passive-aggressive note from Mrs. Chen in 3B. Inside, I peeled off my sodden clothes and stood under a scalding shower until feeling returned to my fingertips. The rain continued its assault on my windows throughout the evening, a constant percussion that made reading impossible and television barely audible. I found myself drawn repeatedly to the window, looking down at the square where I'd encountered the old man. The streetlights cast amber pools on the wet pavement, but I saw no sign of him. Part of me hoped he'd found shelter. Another part wondered if I'd see my umbrella again. It wasn't expensive, but it had been a gift from my sister, complete with my initials embossed on the handle, a small vanity that now seemed foolishly sentimental. I woke the next morning to silence. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind the clean electric smell that always followed storms. Sunlight struggled through my windows, weak but determined, casting long shadows across my hardwood floor. I dressed for work and stepped outside, breathing deeply of the washed air. The square looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, as if the rain had shrunk not just the puddles but the space itself. I walked the same path I'd taken the evening before, half expecting to see the old man waiting with my umbrella. Instead, I found something far more unsettling. There, on the exact spot where I'd encountered him, stood a single umbrella. At first glance, it appeared identical to mine. Black canopy, wooden handle, the same compact folding mechanism. But this one was bone dry, as if it had never known rain. I approached it slowly, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. I picked it up with trembling fingers and immediately noticed the weight was wrong, heavier than mine, with a density that seemed to pull at my hand. The handle was warm to the touch, almost feverish, and when I looked more closely, I could see subtle differences. The wood grain ran in patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the metal hardware had a tarnish that spoke of far more years than my umbrella had seen. But it was when I opened it that my breath caught in my throat. On the inner surface of the canopy, embroidered in silver thread that seemed to glow with its own light, was my name, Thomas Mitchell. Below it, in the same ethereal script, was a date, October 23rd, 2025. That date was still 3 weeks away. I closed the umbrella quickly, looking around to see if anyone had witnessed my discovery. The square was empty save for a few pigeons pecking at breadcrumbs near the fountain. I tucked the umbrella under my arm and continued to work, but my mind remained fixed on those silver threads and what they might mean. The next few days passed in a haze of normalcy that felt increasingly surreal. I went through the motions of my routine, work, lunch, home, but the umbrella dominated my thoughts. I kept it in my apartment, propped against the wall by my front door, where I could see it whenever I entered or left. Sometimes I caught myself staring at it, trying to decipher the craftsmanship of that impossible embroidery. I researched everything I could about umbrellas, embroidery, and dates that hadn't yet occurred. The internet, predictably, offered no answers to questions I couldn't quite formulate. How do you search for mysterious umbrella with future date? The closest I came was a few forum posts about temporal anomalies and urban legends, but those felt too fantastical, too removed from the concrete reality of the object leaning against my wall. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed, listening to the sounds of the city, and find myself straining to hear rain that wasn't falling. The weather had turned fair after that initial storm, with clear skies and gentle breezes that mocked my growing anxiety. Part of me wanted it to rain again, to test whether the umbrella would behave normally, or reveal more of its secrets. Another part dreaded the very thought. As October 23rd approached, my unease deepened into something approaching paranoia. I found myself checking weather forecasts obsessively, both local and national, searching for any sign of the storm I now felt certain was coming. The meteorologists spoke of a high-pressure system that would bring continued fair weather through the end of the month, but their confidence felt hollow. They couldn't see the silver threads or feel the weight of impossible certainty that had settled over my life. I began noticing things that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, but hidden from my perception by the comfortable blindness of routine. Shadows that lingered too long after clouds passed. The way reflections in windows sometimes showed different scenes than what lay behind me. Sounds that seemed to come from directions that shouldn't exist. Whispers that disappeared the moment I turned to locate their source. The old man haunted my thoughts as much as the umbrella. I returned to the square daily, hoping to find him, to demand explanations for the gift he'd left behind. But the space remained stubbornly empty of anything but the usual urban detritus. Discarded newspapers, cigarette butts, the occasional lost glove. It was as if he had never existed, save for the impossible proof leaning against my wall. 3 days before the date, I called in sick to work. I couldn't concentrate on spreadsheets and meetings when reality itself seemed to be unraveling at the edges. I spent the day researching the history of Meridian Square, diving deep into city records and newspaper archives. What I found should have been reassuring, but instead added new layers to my growing dread. The square had been the site of numerous unexplained incidents over the decades. A businessman in 1987 who claimed to have received a watch that showed times from the future. A college student in 1995 who found a book in the fountain containing her own obituary, dated 50 years hence. A mother in 2003 who discovered her child's drawing of a family vacation they had never taken, signed and dated for the following year. The accounts were scattered across different publications, often buried in back pages or dismissed as human interest oddities. But the pattern was unmistakable. Objects appearing in the square that somehow defied the normal flow of time, always connected to dates in the future, always leaving their recipients changed in ways they couldn't fully articulate. I printed every article I could find and spread them across my kitchen table, looking for connections, for some explanation that might restore order to my world. But the only constant was the square itself, and the unsettling sense that whatever force operated there was far older and more complex than I could comprehend. On October 22nd, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by my window, watching the square below, the umbrella within arm's reach. The night was clear, with stars visible despite the city's glow, but I could feel something building in the air. A pressure that made my ears pop and my skin prickle with static electricity. At 3:17 a.m. I saw him. The old man stood exactly where I'd first encountered him, but now he was looking up at my window. Even from 3 stories up, I could see his eyes, those storm cloud irises that seemed to glow with reflected light. He raised one hand in what might have been greeting or farewell, then pointed to the sky. I followed his gesture and watched as the stars began to disappear behind clouds that hadn't been there moments before. The wind picked up, sending leaves and debris skittering across the square in spirals that seemed to follow no natural pattern. The old man remained perfectly still as the chaos swirled around him, his gaze never leaving my window. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no lightning preceded it. The sound seemed to come from beneath the earth rather than above, a deep reverberation that made my building tremble. I pressed my hand against the window glass and felt it vibrating like a drum skin. The first drops of rain began to fall. They struck my window with sounds like tap dancing, each drop creating patterns on the glass that looked almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. The old man below smiled, or perhaps grimaced. The expression was impossible to interpret from this distance, and began to fade. Not walk away, not move into shadow, but simply become translucent, as if the rain were washing him away drop by drop. I grabbed the umbrella and ran from my apartment, taking the stairs 3 at a time. By the time I reached the street, the downpour had intensified into something approaching biblical proportions. Water rushed down gutters and pooled in the square, turning the pavement into a shallow lake that reflected the streetlights like scattered coins. The old man was gone, but I could feel his presence, or perhaps the presence of something far larger and more ancient than one old man. The umbrella in my hand had grown warm again, almost hot, and when I opened it against the deluge, the silver embroidery began to glow with an intensity that should have been visible to anyone watching. But the square was empty save for me and the rain, and the growing certainty that I had become part of something that stretched far beyond my understanding. The water around my feet began to move in patterns that defied gravity, forming spirals and geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. The rain itself seemed to be falling upward in some places, returning to clouds that now pressed so low I could almost touch them. I understood then what the old man had meant about seeing each other when it stopped raining. This storm, this impossible reality-bending deluge, would continue until I made the same choice he had made, until I found someone else caught in the rain and offered them shelter, passing on the umbrella and whatever terrible knowledge came with it. The silver threads spelling my name were already beginning to fade, I realized, replaced by new embroidery that formed even as I watched. Another name, another date, another future that would demand its own payment when the time came. I closed the umbrella and walked back toward my building, no longer caring about the rain soaking through my clothes. The storm would end when I found the right person, someone who would accept this gift without understanding its true cost. Someone who would carry it home and spend sleepless nights staring at impossible dates, waiting for their turn to stand in an empty square and become part of something larger than themselves. The rain continues to fall as I write this, each drop carrying whispers in languages that predate human speech. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the old man in my peripheral vision, nodding approval, or perhaps offering comfort to someone who has joined a fraternity I never knew existed. Tomorrow I will return to the square with the umbrella. I will wait for someone who needs shelter from the storm, and I will make the same offer that was made to me. The cycle will continue, as it has for longer than any of us can remember, each participant adding their own thread to a tapestry whose true pattern remains forever hidden from those who weave it. The only question that remains is whether I will remember this choice as kindness or curse when my time comes to fade into the rain, leaving behind only the echo of my own footsteps and another impossible umbrella for someone else to find. Outside my window, the storm shows no sign of ending, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear footsteps approaching through the rain, slow and deliberate, carrying their own small piece of eternity toward whatever revelation waits at the heart of the tempest. I think I'm beginning to understand what the old man meant about payment. Some debts, it seems, can only be settled by ensuring they're never truly paid at all. Story 9. The F-16's engine sits in the center of Hangar 7 like a metallic heart torn from its chest, still pulsing with ghost rhythms. 3 weeks since the fire, and I can still smell the burned fuel that should have dissipated by now, a phantom odor that clings to my nostrils even when I'm miles away from the base. The Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engine, serial number 890147, was pulled from Captain Morrison's aircraft after what the official report calls catastrophic thermal failure during routine patrol. Our What it doesn't mention is how Morrison landed that bird with half his instruments dark and the cockpit filling with smoke, or how he kept muttering about hearing voices through his headset even after the radio was confirmed dead. I've been working on fighters for 15 years, and engines don't usually get to me. They're machines, complex, temperamental, but ultimately predictable. Metal and fire contained by engineering and physics. This one feels different, though. Even in daylight, even with the hangar doors wide open and maintenance crews bustling around other projects, the engine commands attention in a way that makes my teeth ache. The official maintenance logs show everything normal. Temperature readings, pressure differentials, combustion efficiency, all within acceptable parameters right up until the moment something went catastrophically wrong at 30,000 feet. But I've been staring at these readouts for days, and the numbers tell a story that doesn't add up. The engine was running too perfectly, like it was trying to prove something, like it was performing. That's when I started staying late. The first time was accidental. A blown hydraulic line on a different aircraft kept me past midnight, and I was heading for the parking lot when I heard it, the distinctive whine of a turbine spooling up. Not unusual during day shifts, but at 12:47 a.m., every engine in the hangar should have been cold and silent. I backtracked through the maintenance bays, following the sound, but by the time I reached Hangar 7, everything was quiet. Just the engine sitting there under harsh fluorescent lights, looking exactly as I'd left it hours earlier. I told myself it was another crew working late, maybe running diagnostics on a different bird, except the log showed no one else had been authorized for night work. And the sound, that particular pitch and resonance, belonged to an F-100 engine, Morrison's engine. The second time, I was ready. I brought a thermos of coffee and positioned myself in the office overlooking the hangar floor, lights off, watching through the reinforced glass. At 11:23 p.m., the familiar hydraulic hiss echoed through the space as pumps that should have been disconnected began cycling. The engine's starter engaged with a mechanical grunt, and the turbine blades began their slow rotation, building speed with each revolution. No fuel was flowing. I'd personally drained and secured all lines, but the engine was trying to run anyway, metal components moving through motions that should have been impossible. The instrument panel that I'd physically disconnected from all power sources flickered to life, displays cascading through startup sequences in perfect order. Green lights confirmed systems that weren't there, pressure readings for fuel that wasn't flowing, temperature gauges tracking heat that couldn't exist. Everything showed nominal, optimal, as if the engine was running perfectly under conditions that violated every law of physics I understood. But it was the mission display that made my hands shake around the coffee cup, projected onto the concrete floor in pale green phosphorescence. Target coordinates scrolled past like ghosts of navigation data. Patrol routes over sectors that had been declassified decades ago. Call signs for pilots who'd transferred to other bases or retired years earlier. The display cycled through what looked like dozens of missions, each one tagged with dates spanning the last 15 years. Every flight Morrison's aircraft had ever completed. Then it started showing missions that hadn't happened yet. Future patrol routes with tomorrow's date, next week's date, coordinates for areas that were still classified above my clearance level. The mission clock counted down from T-minus 72 hours, then 71:59, 71:58, as if the engine was preparing for a launch that existed somewhere beyond the hangar, beyond time itself. I documented everything. Photographs that came out strangely blurred despite perfect lighting, video recordings where the audio captured the engine noise, but the visual showed only static components. Even the digital instruments on my multimeter gave impossible readings when I tested the supposedly dead electrical connections. The numbers kept shifting, displaying values that couldn't exist, like the engine was actively resisting measurement. During daylight hours, I performed every test protocol in the maintenance manual and several that weren't. Compression checks, magnetic particle inspection, bore scope examination of the internal components. Everything appeared normal. Better than normal, actually. The engine showed less wear than it should have after 12 years of service, internal tolerances tighter than factory specifications. It was as if the machine was getting younger, rebuilding itself from the inside out. My colleagues started avoiding me. Chief Ramirez mentioned concerns about my obsessive focus during our weekly review, suggesting I take some personal time to decompress from the Morrison incident. But Ramirez hadn't been in the cockpit with Morrison during those final minutes. He hadn't heard what I'd heard through the radio chatter. Not voices exactly, but something underneath the static that sounded almost like breathing. The third night I brought tools. If the engine wanted to run, I'd give it the chance. I worked in darkness, using only a small LED headlamp to reconnect fuel lines and electrical systems that protocol demanded remain secure. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding connections that should have required full documentation and supervisory approval. Part of me knew I was violating a dozen regulations, possibly committing career suicide. But a larger part, the part that had been listening to the engine's phantom operations for weeks, understood that this was necessary. The engine was asking for completion. At 11:47 p.m., I initiated the startup sequence manually. The turbine blades began their rotation, and this time fuel flowed through lines I'd personally reconnected. The combustion chamber ignited with a contained roar that should have triggered every alarm in the building. But the hangar remained silent, except for the growing whine of the turbofan spinning up to operational speed. The mission display blazed to life with renewed intensity, coordinates and call signs scrolling faster now, overlapping each other in patterns that seemed almost eager. Temperature and pressure readings climbed toward optimal ranges, while every gauge confirmed what I already knew. The engine was running perfectly, too perfectly, better than it ever had while installed in Morrison's aircraft. That's when I noticed the difference in the mission data. Instead of historical flights or projected operations, the display showed a single mission profile labeled Scramble Alpha 7 with Morrison's call sign and a set of coordinates I didn't recognize. The countdown timer read T-minus 47 minutes and decreasing. A launch window that corresponded to no scheduled operations, no approved flight plans, no aircraft currently stationed on the base. The engine was preparing for a mission that couldn't exist. I tried shutting down the turbine, but the controls didn't respond. The fuel cutoff valves remained locked in the open position, despite my attempts to close them manually. Even pulling the main electrical breakers had no effect on the spinning turbine or the glowing displays. The engine had achieved some kind of operational autonomy that superseded external control, running on power and fuel that shouldn't have been available. The countdown continued, T-minus 34 minutes. I radioed base security, but my transmission came back as static-filled nonsense that made the duty officer request clarification I couldn't provide. When I tried calling the base phone directory, my cell phone displayed numbers for extensions that had been disconnected years ago, personnel rosters that included names I hadn't heard since my first deployment. Even my own reflection in the hangar windows looked wrong, younger somehow, wearing a maintenance uniform from a different era. T-minus 18 minutes. The engine's roar had become something more than mechanical noise. Underneath the turbine whine, I could hear what Morrison had described in his incident report. Voices. Not quite human, but not entirely machine either. Whispers that might have been radio chatter from missions flown years ago. Call signs belonging to pilots who'd rotated through the squadron across decades of service. Conversations that overlapped and echoed as if the engine had been listening, recording, preserving every word spoken in every cockpit it had ever powered. And beneath those voices, a rhythm that sounded disturbingly like heartbeats. T-minus 7 minutes. I grabbed my tools and headed for the engine, determined to disconnect something, anything, that might interrupt whatever process was building toward completion. But as I approached the turbofan intake, the voices became clearer, more distinct. Morrison's voice, repeating his final transmission before the emergency landing. Base, I'm showing multiple systems failure, but everything reads normal. It's like the bird wants to keep flying. Then my own voice, from earlier that evening. If the engine wanted to run, I'd give it the chance. And finally, a voice I didn't recognize but somehow knew belonged to the engine itself. Mechanical tones shaped into words that bypassed my ears and spoke directly into my thoughts. Installation required for mission completion. Installation required for final approach. T-minus 2 minutes. The hangar lights began flickering in patterns that matched the engine's instrumentation, and the concrete floor vibrated with harmonics that seemed to originate from somewhere deep underground. Every aircraft in adjacent hangars started showing electrical activity despite being powered down and secured. Warning lights blinked in sequence across the maintenance bay, and I could hear the distant whine of other engines beginning their own startup sequences. The entire base was responding to whatever signal Morrison's engine was broadcasting. T-minus 30 seconds. I understood then what the engine wanted, what it had been trying to tell me through weeks of phantom operations and impossible displays. It wasn't broken. It had never been broken. The fire, the emergency landing, the catastrophic thermal failure, all of it had been part of a larger plan. The engine had been removed from Morrison's aircraft, not because it was damaged, but because it was evolving, becoming something that required a different kind of installation, a different kind of pilot. It needed me. T-minus 10 seconds. The mission coordinates on the display resolved into a location I recognized, the exact airspace where Morrison had reported his emergency. The engine wasn't preparing for a new mission. It was preparing to complete the old one, to return to the moment where everything had gone wrong and make it right. But to do that, it needed to be airborne again. It needed to be part of an aircraft that could reach 30,000 feet and maintain position over coordinates that existed in some impossible intersection of memory and time. T-minus 3 seconds. I walked toward the engine intake, understanding that installation didn't mean what I'd thought it meant. The turbofan blades had stopped spinning, but continued glowing with internal heat that cast my shadow in directions that defied the hangar lighting. The voices had become a single whisper that spoke my name with mechanical precision, and the countdown display showed numbers that no longer corresponded to any measurement of time I could recognize. T-minus 0. The next thing I remember, it's morning. I'm standing in the parking lot outside Hangar 7, wearing yesterday's maintenance uniform and holding a thermos of coffee that's still warm. My watch shows 6:47 hours, but I have no memory of leaving the hangar or crossing the tarmac. Inside my pocket, there's a work order I don't remember writing, authorizing the reinstallation of engine serial number 890147 into aircraft tail number 89047. Morrison's bird, which the maintenance logs show was retired and transferred to the boneyard 3 weeks ago. But when I look across the flight line, Morrison's F-16 sits on the maintenance pad, engines installed, and pre-flight inspection complete. The aircraft status board shows it's scheduled for a routine patrol mission over coordinates that match exactly the ones I saw on the engine's phantom display. Takeoff time, 0800 hours. Pilot, unassigned. I checked the duty roster, but my name isn't listed for today's shift. According to the computer system, I completed my rotation yesterday, and I'm not scheduled to return until next week. Yet here I am, with tools in my hand, and a vague memory of installation procedures I don't remember performing. Chief Ramirez finds me standing at the hangar entrance, staring at the empty space where Morrison's engine used to be. He mentions that the overnight crew completed the reinstallation ahead of schedule. Impressive work that has the bird ready for its mission window. But when I ask about the overnight crew, he looks confused and checks the logs that show no one was authorized for night work. The engine is gone. The mission display is gone. The impossible readings and phantom voices have vanished like they never existed. But Morrison's aircraft is ready to fly again. And somewhere in the pre-flight instrumentation, I can hear the faint whine of turbines that sound almost eager. At 0753 hours, I watch an unassigned pilot whose name I don't recognize climb into Morrison's cockpit and begin startup procedures. The engines spool up with perfect harmonics, all readings nominal, systems responding exactly as designed. Radio chatter confirms clearance for takeoff, and the F-16 taxis toward the runway with mechanical precision that seems almost automated. As the aircraft lifts off and heads toward coordinates I somehow still remember, I notice that my reflection in the hangar windows shows a maintenance uniform from a different era, and my own voice echoes in my ears with words I don't remember speaking. Installation complete. Mission authorized for final approach. The aircraft disappears into morning clouds, and I remain on the ground, watching an empty sky and wondering if I've just witnessed a routine patrol mission or something that violates every law of physics and reality I thought I understood. I still work the night shift sometimes, and I still listen for engines that shouldn't be running. But now I wonder if I'm listening for them, or if they're listening for me. Story 10. The advertisement had been almost too good to be true. Spacious room in historic mansion, 400 month, utilities included, quiet neighborhood. What it hadn't mentioned was that the Whitmore estate had served as a tuberculosis sanitarium from 1923 to 1967, or that the quiet neighborhood was quiet because most sensible people avoided the place entirely. I should have noticed the way Mrs. Carlyle's hand trembled when she handed me the keys that first October afternoon. Should have questioned why a room in such a grand old house, with its soaring ceilings, ornate moldings, and stained glass windows, was priced like a studio apartment in the worst part of town. But I was desperate, fresh out of college with student loans breathing down my neck and a job that barely covered ramen noodles, let alone decent housing. The room itself was beautiful, I had to admit. High ceiling with exposed wooden beams, tall windows that looked out over the estate's overgrown gardens, and enough space for my few belongings with room to spare. Mrs. Carlyle had shown me around with nervous efficiency, pointing out the shared bathroom down the hall, the kitchen privileges, the unreliable but functional Wi-Fi. She'd paused at the old elevator at the end of the corridor, its brass accordion gate gleaming despite its obvious age. "That goes down to the basement," she'd said, keys jangling as her hand continued its subtle tremor. "Storage mostly. We keep it locked." Then she'd looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold decades of unspoken warnings. "Winter can be challenging here. The old heating system makes noise, settling sounds. You get used to it." For the first month, everything seemed normal enough. The house had its quirks, pipes that groaned in the walls, floorboards that creaked without cause, radiators that clanked to life at odd hours. I attributed the strange drafts to poor insulation, the way shadows seemed to move independently to tired eyes, and an overactive imagination. I was working long hours at a data entry job downtown, coming home exhausted, and usually falling asleep to the sound of wind through the mansion's many gaps and crevices. It wasn't until the first real cold snap in November that things began to change. I remember the exact night it started, because I'd been lying awake with a persistent cough that had been bothering me for weeks, the kind of dry, scratching cough that seemed to come from deep in my chest and left me gasping. I'd been meaning to see a doctor, but money was tight, and it seemed like the kind of thing that would clear up on its own. The sound came around 2 a.m, a rhythmic squeaking, like metal wheels turning against a wooden floor. At first I thought it might be Mrs. Carlyle with a cart, maybe doing late-night maintenance or moving supplies. But the sound was too measured, too deliberate. It moved down the hallway outside my room with mechanical precision, neither hurrying nor hesitating. I crept to the door and peered through the crack beneath it. A shadow passed slowly, blocking the thin line of hallway light that usually seeped under my door. The shadow was long and rectangular, the unmistakable silhouette of a wheeled stretcher or gurney. But when I pressed my ear to the door, I could hear only the squeaking wheels. No footsteps, no breathing, no human presence guiding whatever was casting that shadow. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The rational explanation was that Mrs. Carlyle had been moving furniture or supplies, and my half-asleep mind had distorted the memory. But that evening I found myself lying awake again, listening for the sound. It came at exactly the same time, 2:17 a.m. according to my phone, and followed the same path down the corridor. This time, I worked up the courage to open my door just a crack. The hallway was empty, completely, utterly empty. But I could still hear the wheels, still see the shadow moving along the opposite wall as if cast by something invisible. The sound continued past my room, down the hallway toward the elevator, and then simply stopped. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated. Always at 2:17 a.m., always the same route, always ending at the elevator. I began to dread going to sleep, lying in bed with mounting anxiety as the clock approached the dreaded time. My cough was getting worse too, deep rattling fits that left me breathless and dizzy. I started keeping a glass of water by my bed, but it never seemed to help. The first time I saw the masks, I thought they were decorations I'd somehow missed before. Old-fashioned respirators hung from the exposed beams of my ceiling, the kind with round glass eyepieces and rubber tubes that looked like something from a wartime gas attack. They were antiques, surely, museum pieces that added to the mansion's historical atmosphere. But as December deepened and my cough worsened, I began to notice details that made my skin crawl. The masks were damp, not dusty, as abandoned antiques should be, but beaded with moisture that caught the light from my bedside lamp. Sometimes in the early morning hours, I could swear I saw them moving slightly, as if they were breathing. Condensation would form on the glass eyepieces, fogging them over, and when it cleared, I had the unsettling sensation that something was looking back at me. Worse still were the stains appearing on my newly painted wooden floor. Rust-colored droplets that seemed to fall from nowhere, appearing overnight in perfect circles beneath the hanging masks. I cleaned them obsessively, but they always returned, sometimes in the same spots, sometimes in new configurations that suggested a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. I tried talking to Mrs. Carlyle about the masks, approaching the subject carefully during one of our brief encounters in the kitchen. She was making tea with shaking hands, and when I mentioned finding some old medical equipment in my room, she nearly dropped the kettle. "Oh, those," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Historical artifacts. The family that owns the house. They like to preserve the building's heritage." She paused, staring into her teacup as if it might offer salvation. "Did you know this place treated over 3,000 patients during its operational years? 3,000 souls who came here hoping to breathe easier." The way she said souls made something cold crawl up my spine. "Did many of them recover?" Mrs. Carlyle finally looked at me, and her eyes held a sadness so deep it seemed to have its own gravity. "Some did. Others, well, tuberculosis was often a death sentence in those days. But they all hoped. Right until the end, they all hoped the next treatment would be the one that worked." That night, the wheeled shadow was joined by others. I watched through my door crack as multiple silhouettes passed. Some long and low like gurneys, others upright and human-shaped, but moving with a gliding motion that suggested no legs touched the floor. The squeaking wheels were now accompanied by other sounds. The whisper of cloth against cloth, the soft sigh of labored breathing, the distant echo of coughing fits that seemed to come from the walls themselves. My own cough was becoming constant now, a hacking bark that left my throat raw and my chest aching. I'd lost weight without noticing, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror showed hollowed cheeks and dark circles under my eyes that made me look like a photograph from the sanitarium's historical archives. It was during one of my midnight vigils, pressed against my door and watching the parade of shadows, that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the upright silhouettes had stopped directly in front of my room. It stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and I had the absolute certainty that whatever was casting that shadow was looking directly at my door, looking at me. The next morning, I found it. A manila folder placed precisely in the center of my bed, though I was certain I'd left the room empty when I went to shower. The folder was old, its edges soft with age, and across the front tab someone had written "Patient 847" in faded blue ink. Below that, in handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own, was my full name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a medical chart filled out in meticulous detail. Every symptom I'd been experiencing was listed: the persistent cough, the weight loss, the night sweats I'd been attributing to the mansion's erratic heating. But there were other notations too, symptoms I hadn't experienced yet, but that sent ice through my veins as I read them. Increasing fatigue, elevated temperature, bloody sputum. At the bottom of the chart, in the same careful handwriting, was an appointment notation. Radiography scheduled for tomorrow, 2:17 a.m., basement level, X-ray suite. 2:17 a.m., the exact time the shadows made their nightly journey. I told myself it was a cruel joke, maybe some twisted hazing ritual for new tenants. But as I sat there holding the folder, I realized my hands were trembling with the same palsy that affected Mrs. Carlyle. The paper felt real, substantial, and warm to the touch, as if it had been recently handled by living fingers. That evening, I made a decision that still haunts me. Instead of leaving, packing my few belongings and finding somewhere, anywhere else to live, I decided to follow the shadows, to discover once and for all what was happening in this house, whether it was elaborate theater or something that defied rational explanation. I positioned myself in the hallway well before 2:17 a.m., back pressed against the wall in a spot where I could see the elevator without being easily spotted. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited, the manila folder clutched in my sweating hands like a ticket to some nightmare carnival. At exactly 2:17, they came. Not shadows this time, but translucent figures that moved with purpose down the hallway. Men and women in hospital gowns that seemed to flutter without any breeze, their faces gaunt and pale but unmistakably human. Some pushed wheelchairs, others supported each other with the careful tenderness of the very sick, caring for the equally ill. They moved in complete silence, their feet, if they had feet, making no sound against the wooden floor. I watched in paralyzed fascination as they gathered near the elevator. The brass gate stood open, though I was certain Mrs. Carlyle had told me it was always locked. One by one, they filed inside, disappearing into the car's shadowy interior. Last was a figure I recognized with a shock that nearly made me cry out. A man about my age with my build, my hair color, wearing clothes identical to my own pajamas. He turned just before entering the elevator, and our eyes met across the hallway. He smiled, a sad, knowing expression that spoke of acceptance and resignation, and gestured for me to follow. The elevator began its descent without anyone touching the controls. I could hear the machinery groaning as it carried its impossible passengers down to the basement level, to whatever waited in the X-ray suite mentioned on my chart. The sound faded gradually, leaving me alone in the hallway with the manila folder, and a certainty that if I entered that elevator, I would never return to my room as the same person. For a long moment, I stood frozen, part of me desperate to follow, to understand, to meet whatever appointment had been scheduled for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was madness, hallucination, the product of stress and isolation, and possibly carbon monoxide poisoning from the old heating system. But as I turned away from the elevator, I caught my reflection in the darkened window at the end of the hall. The face looking back at me was gaunt, hollow-eyed, with the unmistakable pallor of the very sick. My cheeks were sunken, my lips had a bluish tinge, and when I raised my hand to touch my face, the reflection moved a split second before I did. I ran then, clutching the folder to my chest as I fled back to my room. I slammed the door and turned the lock, though I wasn't sure what I was trying to keep out, or keep in. The masks hanging from my ceiling beams seemed to watch me with their fogged glass eyes as I sat on my bed, staring at the medical chart that bore my name. Outside my door, I could hear the elevator returning, carrying its passengers back to whatever realm of existence they inhabited when not making their nightly rounds. The sound of wheels and whispered voices faded gradually, leaving only the ticking of my bedside clock and the increasingly labored rhythm of my own breathing. I'm writing this now as dawn breaks through my windows, though the light seems dimmer than it should be, filtered through what looks like fog but might be something else entirely. The manila folder sits open beside me, and I notice that new entries have appeared on the medical chart, symptoms I've developed just since yesterday, written in handwriting that grows more and more like my own with each line. In a few hours I could leave this place, pack my things, forfeit my deposit, and find somewhere else to live. Somewhere with better heating, fewer shadows, and no mysterious medical charts that seem to write themselves. I could see a doctor about my cough, get proper treatment, return to a world where elevators require human operators, and shadows stay properly attached to the objects that cast them. But as I sit here, listening to the mansion settling around me like an old friend making itself comfortable, I find myself wondering if it's already too late. The appointment card tucked into the folder shows today's date, and I can feel something pulling at me, a gentle but insistent summons that grows stronger as the hours pass. Tonight, when 2:17 a.m. arrives, I think I'll be ready for my appointment. After all, according to the chart, I'm already patient 847, and in a place like the Whitmore estate, Where the past refuses to stay buried and hope persists long after healing becomes impossible, perhaps the only way out is through. The elevator is calling, and I find myself surprisingly eager to answer. Story 11. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour convenience store buzzed with their familiar electrical hum as I pushed through the glass door, the bell chiming my arrival into the antiseptic brightness. Another late night at the office, another stop for coffee that would keep me wired until dawn. The routine had become as predictable as the taste of burnt coffee from the machine near the register. Bitter, necessary, and somehow comforting in its reliability. The clerk barely glanced up from his phone, his face pale and gaunt under the harsh lighting. I'd seen him dozens of times before, but tonight something felt different about his expression. Distant, as if he were looking through me rather than at me. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling my cup with the dark liquid that would fuel the rest of my evening. The familiar ritual should have been reassuring, but instead, an inexplicable unease settled into my chest like cold water. Outside, the parking lot stretched empty, except for my sedan and a delivery truck idling near the dumpster. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and something else. Something metallic and stale, like old pennies left in a jar. I fumbled for my keys, eager to get home and leave this strange mood behind. That's when it happened. The moment I stepped beyond the store's neon-bright entrance, the world around me shifted. The harsh white streetlights dimmed to a warm sepia glow, as if someone had placed an amber filter over reality itself. The asphalt beneath my feet seemed softer, less defined, and every surface took on the grainy quality of an old photograph. The convenience store's bright signs became unreadable smears of light, their letters dissolving into meaningless shapes that hurt my eyes when I tried to focus on them. I blinked hard, certain my vision was playing tricks on me. Too many late nights, too much caffeine, too little sleep. But when I opened my eyes, the sepia world remained, frozen in its antique stillness. Even the sounds had changed, muffled and distant, as if filtered through layers of cotton or time itself. That's when I noticed him. A man stood near the edge of the parking lot, just where the sepia light faded into deeper shadows. He wore a long gray overcoat that seemed to absorb the strange amber glow, and his face was obscured by the brim of a dark hat. Despite the distance between us, I could feel his attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He began walking toward me with measured steps, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the sepia-tinted pavement. But here's what made my breath catch in my throat. While his shadow moved and elongated with each step, his body remained perfectly still, as if the shadow had detached itself and was moving independently. The man spoke, though I couldn't see his lips move beneath the hat's shadow. His voice carried across the space between us with unnatural clarity, despite the muffled quality of everything else in this amber world. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but somehow wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." He extended his hand, and in it was a small rectangular box, unmarked and black as midnight. Even in the sepia light, it seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. "I don't understand," I managed to say, surprised by how normal my own voice sounded in this strange space. "The film of 1932, he said, as if this explained everything. "I need you to return it." I found myself reaching for the box, though every instinct screamed against it. My fingers closed around the smooth surface, and immediately I felt a cold that seemed to seep through my skin and into my bones. The man's shadow continued to stretch toward me, now reaching across the entire parking lot, while his body remained motionless in the distance. "But I don't have any film," I protested, even as my hand clutched the mysterious box. The man tilted his head slightly, and for a moment I thought I glimpsed something pale and wrong where his face should be. "You will," he said simply. I took a step backward, then another, desperate to escape this sepia nightmare, and returned to the familiar harsh reality of streetlights and readable signs. The man's shadow followed me, stretching impossibly long, while his body grew smaller in the distance without ever seeming to move. With a few more hurried steps, I crossed back into the normal world. Color flooded back into my vision like water breaking through a dam. The streetlights blazed white and electric. The store signs became legible again, and the sounds of the night, distant traffic, the hum of power lines, the rustle of wind through dead leaves, returned with startling clarity. I spun around to look for the man in the gray overcoat, but the parking lot was empty. Only my car and the delivery truck remained, exactly as they had been before. The driver of the truck was walking back from the dumpster, and he nodded at me casually as he climbed into his cab. But the box was still in my hand. I held it up to the light, examining its smooth black surface. There were no markings, no labels, nothing to indicate what it might contain. It was slightly warm now, as if it had absorbed heat from my palm, and it felt heavier than it should have for its size. That's when I noticed the image. On the top of the box, barely visible in the streetlight's glare, was a photograph that definitely hadn't been there moments before. It showed a silhouette, my silhouette, opening the door of a car. But it wasn't my car. This vehicle was older, with rounded curves and chrome details that belonged to another era. The photograph had the grainy, faded quality of something taken decades ago. My hands trembled as I turned the box over, looking for some explanation, some rational way to understand what was happening. But the bottom was as smooth and unmarked as the rest of it. I drove home in a state of growing unease, the box sitting on the passenger seat like a sleeping animal. Every few seconds I found myself glancing at it, half expecting it to have changed or disappeared. But it remained stubbornly real, its black surface reflecting the passing streetlights in ways that seemed just slightly wrong. At home, I set the box on my kitchen table and stared at it under the bright overhead light. The photograph was clearer now, showing more detail than should have been possible in such an old image. I could see the license plate on the vintage car, though the numbers were too blurry to read. I could see the texture of my jacket, even though I'd never owned a jacket like the one the silhouette was wearing. I opened my laptop and began searching for anything related to film of 1932, expecting to find references to movies from that year. Instead, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. There had been a missing person case in 1932, a man named Thomas Brennan who had disappeared from this very town. The police reports, digitized and available online, described how Brennan had last been seen leaving a late-night diner, walking toward his car in the parking lot. He had never been found. But that wasn't the worst part. The police report included a description of Brennan's vehicle, a dark sedan with chrome details and curved fenders, the exact car from the photograph on the box. I spent the rest of the night researching, following threads of information that led deeper into the past. Thomas Brennan had been an amateur photographer who specialized in street scenes and urban landscapes. He had been working on a project about nightlife in small towns, documenting the people who populated the spaces between sunset and dawn. According to the sparse records I could find, Brennan had been particularly interested in what he called threshold moments, the spaces between day and night, between the normal world and something else. His final photographs, taken the week before his disappearance, showed increasingly strange images. Streetlights that cast shadows at impossible angles, people whose reflections didn't match their bodies, buildings that seemed to exist in two different time periods simultaneously. The last photograph in his collection, taken the night he disappeared, showed a parking lot outside what appeared to be a small store. The image was heavily sepia-toned, and the signs in the background were completely illegible, as if the letters had melted off the surfaces. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, was the shadow of a man in a long coat. As dawn approached, I found myself staring at the box with exhausted eyes and a racing mind. The photograph on its surface seemed to grow clearer with each passing hour, revealing new details that definitely hadn't been there before. Now I could see the expression on the silhouette's face, my face, and it was one of confused recognition, as if I were seeing something familiar yet impossible. The kitchen filled with morning light, but the box seemed to absorb it, remaining as dark as midnight. I reached out to touch the photograph, and the moment my finger made contact with the surface, I felt that same bone-deep cold I'd experienced in the parking lot. The image rippled like water, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw it move. The silhouette, my silhouette, turned slightly, as if acknowledging my presence. Then it opened the car door and began to climb inside. I jerked my hand back, and the photograph returned to its static state. But something had changed. The car door was now fully open, and the silhouette was halfway inside the vehicle. The photograph was progressing, advancing through a sequence of events that had supposedly taken place nearly a century ago. Over the following days, I found myself checking the box obsessively. Each time I looked, the photograph had advanced slightly. The silhouette climbed fully into the car, started the engine, and began to drive away. But with each progression, the image became more detailed, more real, and more obviously me. I stopped going to work, stopped answering my phone, stopped doing anything except watching the photograph change. My friends left concerned messages, but their voices seemed to come from another world, another reality where boxes didn't show impossible images, and shadows didn't move independently of their owners. The convenience store began to feel like a place I needed to avoid, though I couldn't say why. On the few occasions when I drove past it, the building seemed different somehow. Older, with a sepia tint to its walls and signs that flickered between readable and meaningless, depending on the angle of my vision. But it was the dreams that truly began to unravel my sense of reality. Every night, I found myself walking through that same amber-tinted parking lot, approaching the vintage car from the photograph. In the dreams, I could feel the keys in my hand, could smell the leather seats and old tobacco that lingered in the car's interior. I would climb inside, start the engine, and begin to drive through streets that were familiar yet wrong, populated by people in clothes from decades past. The dreams always ended the same way. I would arrive at a destination I couldn't quite remember upon waking, park the car, and walk toward a building that existed in the space between then and now. Inside, I would find shelves lined with black boxes identical to the one now sitting on my kitchen table. Each box contained a photograph, and each photograph showed a different person, a different car, a different moment of crossing over from one reality to another. And behind the counter, wearing his gray overcoat and dark hat, stood the man from the parking lot. He would nod at me politely and ask if I was ready to return the film of 1932. I would reach into my pocket and find the box there, warm and heavy and somehow alive. But when I tried to hand it to him, my hand would pass through his, and I would realize that I was the one behind the counter now, wearing the gray overcoat and asking the next person to return their film. Then I would wake up, gasping and disoriented, to find the box still sitting on my kitchen table. But each morning, the photograph had progressed a little further. The car was moving now, driving through streets that looked more and more like the ones from my dreams. I began to research the building where I worked, the route I took home each night, the convenience store where this had all started. What I found sent ice through my veins. The store had been built on the site of an old diner, the same diner where Thomas Brennan had last been seen in 1932. The parking lot was in the exact same location, and according to old city planning documents, the layout hadn't changed in nearly a century. More disturbing still were the other disappearances I discovered. Every few decades, someone would vanish from that same parking lot. Always at night, always after leaving the diner or its subsequent iterations. The victims were always found to have some connection to photography or visual media, and in each case, they left behind mysterious black boxes containing photographs that police described as impossible or unnatural. The boxes were always confiscated as evidence, then somehow disappeared from police storage within a matter of weeks. I tried to destroy the box, tried to throw it away, tried to leave it somewhere far from my home, but it always returned, appearing on my kitchen table or in my car or beside my bed as if it had never left. The photograph continued its slow progression, showing me driving through an increasingly familiar landscape toward an inevitable destination. Last night, the photograph showed the car pulling into a parking lot. I recognized the location immediately. It was the same parking lot where I'd encountered the man in the gray overcoat, but as it had appeared in 1932. The silhouette of myself was stepping out of the vintage car, walking toward a diner that glowed with warm amber light. This morning, when I checked the box one final time, the photograph had changed completely. Instead of showing the parking lot or the car, it now displayed the interior of what appeared to be an old diner. And standing behind the counter, wearing a gray overcoat and dark hat, was a figure whose face I could finally see clearly. It was my own face, aged and strange, looking directly out of the photograph with eyes that held decades of patient waiting. Tonight, I know I'll drive to the convenience store one more time. I'll park in the same spot, walk across the same pavement, and wait for the world to take on that familiar sepia glow. And when the man in the gray overcoat approaches me, when I approach myself, I'll finally understand what it means to return the film of 1932. The box sits before me now, warm and alive and humming with possibility. The photograph has begun to move again, showing the diner's interior with increasing clarity. I can see other figures now, other people who have made this same journey across time and reality. They're all waiting behind the counter, wearing identical gray overcoats and patient expressions. There's room for one more. The sun is setting, painting my kitchen in shades of amber and gold. Soon it will be time to take my final drive to the convenience store, to complete the circle that began nearly a century ago with a man named Thomas Brennan and his camera. I understand now that some photographs don't just capture moments. They create them, again and again, in an endless loop of sepia-tinted possibility. The box grows warmer in my hands, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear the sound of an old car engine starting. It's time to return the film of 1932 and finally become part of the collection. Story 12. The altitude hit me first. That familiar thinness in the air that makes every breath feel borrowed. I'd driven up the winding mountain road to the remote chalet in the Chilean Andes, expecting nothing more than a quiet research retreat, a place to work on my geological survey away from the distractions of Santiago. The property manager had mentioned the building's history in passing, an old mining operation from the 1890s, converted decades later into a rustic getaway for tourists seeking authenticity in the high country. What he hadn't mentioned was the weight that seemed to press down on everything here, heavier than the thin air could account for. The chalet perched on a narrow ledge carved into the mountainside, its weathered timber walls and slate roof appearing to grow directly from the granite beneath. 2 stories of rough-hewn logs and stone, with a wraparound balcony on the second floor that offered commanding views of the valley below. During the day, the vista was spectacular, endless peaks rolling away like frozen waves under the crystalline sky. But as evening approached, those same mountains seemed to lean inward, crowding the building with their ancient bulk. I'd been there 3 days when I first saw him. I was working late in the main room, spreadsheets of mineral composition data glowing on my laptop screen, when movement outside caught my peripheral vision. Through the glass doors leading to the second-floor balcony, a yellowish light flickered against the darkness. Not the steady beam of a flashlight, but the wavering glow of an old-fashioned lantern. My first thought was that someone had gotten lost on the mountain trails. The property was isolated, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound 15 miles up from the nearest village, but hikers occasionally ventured this high despite the risks. I stepped onto the balcony, the night air sharp enough to sting my lungs, and peered down at the terrain below. The light moved with purpose through what appeared to be the ruins of old mining structures, collapsed stone foundations, and the skeletal remains of wooden supports that I'd noticed during my arrival, but hadn't paid much attention to. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a figure carrying the lantern, a man in dark clothing, and what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. He moved among the ruins with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. I called out, my voice echoing off the surrounding peaks, but received no response. The figure continued his methodical search through the debris, occasionally pausing to examine something more closely. From my vantage point, it looked like he was picking through the rubble, perhaps searching for artifacts or remnants from the old mining days. After watching for nearly an hour, I went back inside. Mountain people were often eccentric, and if the man was a local scavenger or historian, it wasn't my business to interfere. But sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of tunnels and the distant sound of metal on stone. The next morning brought no sign that anyone had been near the property. I walked the perimeter where I'd seen the light, but the rocky ground revealed nothing. No footprints, no disturbed stones, no evidence of the systematic search I'd witnessed. Even more puzzling, the ruins themselves looked different in daylight. Less extensive, more weathered, as if what I'd seen the night before had been a more complete version of structures now reduced to little more than scattered stones. I told myself that darkness and altitude could play tricks on perception. Mountain environments were notorious for optical illusions, and I'd been working long hours, my sleep cycle disrupted by the change in elevation. The rational explanation satisfied me during the bright mountain morning, but as evening approached again, I found myself drawn repeatedly to the balcony doors. The lantern appeared again the second night, following the same general pattern, but exploring a different section of the ruins. This time I was ready with binoculars, and the magnified view revealed details that made my skin crawl despite the logical voice in my head insisting on mundane explanations. The man's clothing looked authentically period, not the costume of a reenactor or the practical gear of a modern explorer, but genuinely old fabric and cut. His hat was a battered felt thing that could have come straight from a daguerreotype, and his movements had a strange quality, as if he was simultaneously urgent and methodical, driven by some internal imperative that brooked no deviation. But it was his face, glimpsed briefly when he turned toward the chalet, that made me step back from the railing. Even through the binoculars, in the wavering lantern light, his features appeared wrong somehow. Not deformed or obviously supernatural, but possessing a quality that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, like trying to focus on something at the edge of vision that constantly slipped away. When I looked again, he was gone. The lantern light had simply vanished, leaving me staring into absolute darkness. Over the following days, I tried to research the property's history. The satellite internet connection was unreliable, cutting out frequently during storms that rolled through the peaks with surprising suddenness, but I managed to piece together fragments of information. The mining operation had indeed been active in the 1890s, part of the broader gold rush that had swept through this region of the Andes. According to the sparse records I could find, it had been a small-scale operation owned by a man named Esteban Morales, who had worked the claim for nearly 15 years without significant success. The operation had closed abruptly in 1904, though the records were unclear about why. Some sources suggested that Morales had simply given up after years of marginal returns. Others hinted at more dramatic circumstances: accidents, disputes with suppliers, or problems with the local authorities. One brief mention in a regional newspaper from 1905 referred to the unfortunate circumstances surrounding the closure, but provided no details. What struck me most was how thoroughly the operation seemed to have been forgotten. For a mining claim that had operated for 15 years in a region where such enterprises were significant parts of local history, the documentation was surprisingly thin. It was as if someone had deliberately obscured the records, or as if the mountain itself had somehow swallowed the memory. The nightly appearances continued, but with variations that suggested a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. Sometimes the figure appeared in the ruins below, sometimes closer to the chalet itself. Twice I saw the lantern light moving inside what I had assumed were empty structures, illuminating windows in buildings that appeared as mere foundations during the day. On the seventh night, the pattern changed completely. I was working late again, trying to focus on my data, but finding my attention constantly drawn to the windows, when I heard footsteps directly above me. Heavy, deliberate steps moving across the upper floor of the chalet, the floor I was currently on. The building had only 2 stories, and I was alone. I sat frozen at my laptop, every nerve ending suddenly alive with primitive alarm. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth in what sounded like the bedroom directly above the main room. But there was no floor above the main room. I'd explored every inch of the building during my first day, mapping out the layout for my own peace of mind. The pacing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat and the whisper of wind around the building's corners. Then, with a clarity that made my stomach lurch, I heard the sound of digging. Not the sharp ring of metal on stone, but the softer scraping of tools working through wood and plaster. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, my footsteps seeming unnaturally loud on the worn wooden boards. The upstairs layout was simple: 2 bedrooms, a small bathroom, and a storage area under the eaves. I checked each room methodically, examining walls, floors, and ceilings for any sign of disturbance. In the larger bedroom, I found them: footprints in what looked like fine golden dust, tracking across the floorboards from the window to the far wall. The prints were clear enough to show the outline of heavy work boots, and they sparkled faintly in my flashlight beam as if embedded with tiny flecks of metal. I followed the trail to where it ended abruptly at the wall. There was nothing obviously different about that section. The same rough-hewn logs and chinking as the rest of the building. But when I pressed my ear against the wood, I could swear I heard something moving on the other side, a faint scratching that seemed to respond to my presence. Over the next hour, I examined every inch of that wall, running my hands over the logs, checking for hidden panels or loose sections. I found nothing, but the scratching sounds continued, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind the point where I was touching the wall. When I finally returned downstairs, the footprints were gone. I climbed back up immediately, flashlight in hand, but the bedroom floor showed no trace of the golden dust or the clear boot prints I'd followed just minutes before. Sleep became impossible. I spent the remaining hours until dawn alternating between rational explanations and increasingly frantic research into the property's history. The internet connection failed repeatedly, but during brief windows of connectivity, I managed to find a digitized mining survey from 1903. According to the survey, Esteban Morales had been convinced that a significant quartz vein ran directly beneath the current location of the chalet. His operation had been focused on following that vein, and his maps showed extensive tunnel networks that supposedly extended under the building site. The survey report noted that Morales had become obsessed with the pursuit of this supposed mother lode, and had continued digging long after practical considerations should have forced him to abandon the claim. The report's final entry was dated 3 months before the operation's closure. It mentioned that Morales had breached the interior space of the residence while following the vein, and that structural integrity of the domestic building may be compromised by continued excavation. I read that passage 3 times before the implications fully sank in. Morales hadn't just been mining near the current chalet site. He'd been digging directly underneath it, following veins of quartz that he believed would lead to gold. The building I was staying in might be riddled with tunnels, and the sounds I'd been hearing could be structural settling as those old excavations continued to shift and collapse. The rational explanation should have been comforting, but something about the dates bothered me. If Morales had been forced to stop his excavations in 1904 due to structural concerns, and if he'd been working the claim for 15 years, then he would have started his operation around 1889. But the earliest records I'd found suggested the mining hadn't begun until 1891. More troubling was a detail I'd missed during my first reading of the survey. The document referred repeatedly to Morales's nocturnal work habits and his insistence on pursuing the vein during hours of darkness. The surveyor had noted this as unusual, since mining work was typically conducted during daylight hours for safety reasons. Esteban Morales had been a night miner, working by lantern light in the hours when most people slept. The 8th night brought the most vivid manifestation yet. I'd given up any pretense of working and was sitting in the main room with all the lights on, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, when the scratching sounds began again. But this time they weren't coming from upstairs. They were coming from directly beneath me. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful, like someone working methodically through layers of material. It would pause occasionally, as if the digger was examining what they'd uncovered, then resume with renewed intensity. As I listened, other sounds joined the scratching: the clink of metal tools, the soft thud of displaced earth, and something that might have been labored breathing. I found myself standing without conscious decision, drawn toward the sound despite every instinct screaming at me to leave the building entirely. The scratching was loudest near the stone fireplace, and when I knelt and pressed my ear to the floor, I could hear it with perfect clarity. Someone digging just below the floorboards, working their way systematically through whatever lay between the building's foundation and the old tunnel network. A new sound made me jerk upright. Footsteps on the wooden staircase, heavy and deliberate, climbing toward the second floor. But I was alone in the building, and the sounds from below continued uninterrupted, which meant that whatever was climbing the stairs was separate from whatever was digging beneath the floor. I stood paralyzed in the center of the room as the footsteps reached the upper landing and began moving through the bedrooms. I could track their progress by the creaking of floorboards, hear them pause at the same wall where I'd found the golden footprints. The scratching from below intensified, as if responding to the presence above. Then, impossibly, I heard the sound of voices. Two men speaking in what sounded like Spanish, their words too muffled by wood and stone for me to make out clearly. The conversation had the rhythm of planning, with one voice asking questions and the other responding with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. The realization hit me with the force of absolute certainty. I was listening to two different time periods simultaneously. Whatever was happening in the tunnels below and the rooms above wasn't occurring in my present moment. It was an echo or replay of events from over a century ago, when Esteban Morales had been pursuing his obsessive search for the mother lode. But even as I accepted that explanation, a detail emerged that shattered my newfound rationality. One of the voices upstairs had switched to English, speaking with an accent I recognized because I heard it every time I opened my mouth. The second voice belonged to me. I was having a conversation with someone in a room directly above my head, discussing plans and procedures in a casual tone that suggested we'd been working together for some time. I heard myself laugh at something the other man said, the sound carrying clearly through the floorboards, and I felt my knees buckle as the impossibility of the situation crashed over me. I wasn't just witnessing some historical replay. I was somehow part of it. The voices faded, but the scratching from below continued throughout the night. I sat in the chair, afraid to move, afraid to investigate further, afraid of what I might discover if I went upstairs and found evidence of my own presence in a conversation that couldn't have happened. When morning came, I forced myself to check the bedroom where I'd heard the voices. The golden footprints were back, but this time they weren't alone. Alongside the heavy work boots was a second set of prints, lighter and more modern, that matched the tread pattern of my own hiking boots perfectly. The prints led to the same wall, but now there was something different about the logs at that spot. The wood grain seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it, and when I pressed my hand against the surface, it felt warm, as if something was moving just beneath. I started packing immediately, but as I loaded my equipment into the rental car, I found myself pausing repeatedly to examine rocks in the driveway. Without conscious thought, I was collecting samples, drawn to specimens that showed interesting mineral compositions or unusual crystal formations. My geological training took over, and I spent nearly an hour cataloging stones that I'd walked past dozens of times without noticing. Several of the samples showed clear signs of gold content. I drove away from the chalet that afternoon, but the samples came with me. During the long descent from the mountains, I found myself planning a return trip. There were surveys to be conducted, mineral rights to be investigated, proper equipment to be brought up from Santiago. The preliminary assays I could conduct with my portable testing kit showed promising results. Nothing that would justify a full-scale operation, but enough to warrant further investigation. By the time I reached the valley floor, I was already composing emails to colleagues, outlining the potential for a small-scale research operation in the area. The historical precedent was there. The geological indicators were encouraging, and with modern techniques, it might be possible to succeed where Esteban Morales had failed. The rational part of my mind recognized what was happening. That same obsessive drive that had consumed Morales was taking hold of me, fed by samples that might contain nothing more than fool's gold and wishful thinking. But the samples were real, the mineral content was measurable, and the opportunity was too significant to ignore. I'm writing this account 3 weeks after leaving the chalet, in my hotel room in Santiago as I wait for equipment to arrive from the United States. Tomorrow I'll drive back up the mountain road with everything needed for a proper geological survey. The property manager has agreed to let me stay as long as necessary, and I've arranged for supplies to be delivered weekly. Part of me knows I shouldn't return. The logical warnings are all there, clear as the mineral veins I've been studying in my samples. But the gold content is real, and with the right approach, the right techniques, I'm confident I can succeed where others have failed. The scratching sounds have followed me to Santiago. Every night, in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear that same methodical digging coming from somewhere below my hotel room. It's fainter here, muffled by distance and urban noise, but unmistakably the same rhythm I learned to recognize during my week at the chalet. I know it's impossible. The hotel sits on solid bedrock, with no mining history and no tunnels beneath its foundation. But I also know what I'm hearing, and I know that the sound grows stronger each time I examine the golden samples in my equipment case. Tonight, for the first time, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Heavy work boots on carpet, pacing back and forth in front of my door with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world to wait. I haven't opened the door to look. I'm not sure I want to see who's waiting for me in the corridor, or what they might be wearing, or whether their face will remain solid when I try to focus on it directly. But I know they'll be there tomorrow night too, and the night after that, for as long as it takes me to finish what was started over a century ago in the tunnels beneath a chalet in the Chilean Andes. The vein is real, the gold is real, and tomorrow I'll have the equipment to follow it wherever it leads, even if that means digging through foundations that shouldn't exist and tunnels that can't possibly connect the mountains to a hotel room in Santiago. The scratching has started again. Methodical, purposeful, getting closer. I should be afraid, but instead, I find myself reaching for my geological hammer, testing its weight in my hand, imagining how it will feel when I finally strike the right spot on the right wall and break through to whatever has been waiting for me in the darkness below. The lantern light is growing brighter. Story 13. The lease agreement felt wrong in my hands from the moment I signed it. Not the yellowed paper or the faded ink that suggested it had been photocopied too many times, but that one peculiar clause buried in paragraph 7. Tenant agrees to respect the unlisted tenants and their established routines. When I asked the landlord about it, he'd simply shrugged and muttered something about previous residents having particular habits. The rent was too good to question further. Marcus and Jake seemed equally unbothered by the oddity. We were 3 college graduates scraping together enough to afford anything decent in the city, and this 3-bedroom row house in the older district felt like a miracle. The previous tenant had left suddenly, according to the landlord, though he remained vague about the circumstances. The house itself appeared solid enough. Hardwood floors that creaked in places, radiators that clanged occasionally, windows that rattled when trucks passed. Nothing unusual for a building that had seen decades of residents come and go. The first week passed without incident. We established our routines. Marcus claimed the largest bedroom upstairs, Jake took the middle room, and I settled into the ground floor bedroom near the kitchen. The layout worked well enough, though the kitchen felt perpetually cold despite the functioning radiator, and the hallway between our rooms seemed to amplify every footstep and door creak throughout the house. It was Jake who first mentioned the Wednesday sounds. He brought it up casually during our second week, commenting that someone must have been doing dishes quite early that morning. Marcus and I exchanged glances. Neither of us had been awake before noon on our day off. Jake insisted he'd heard distinct sounds from the kitchen around dawn, the deliberate clatter of plates, and the steady rhythm of washing. When we checked, the kitchen was exactly as we'd left it the night before, complete with our accumulated mess of dirty dishes stacked beside the sink. The following Wednesday, I heard them too. The first sound came from the kitchen, a deep, resonant knock that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves rather than from any door or cabinet. It repeated 3 times with mechanical precision, each knock separated by exactly 5 seconds. I lay in bed, counting the intervals, trying to rationalize the sound as settling pipes or expanding wood. Then came the second sequence from the hallway just outside my room. 3 medium-pitched taps, like knuckles against hollow wood, but there was no one in the hallway. Finally, from the direction of the upstairs bathroom, 3 sharp, almost musical tones rang out, as if someone were tapping a crystal glass with a metal spoon. The pattern became our Wednesday morning symphony. Marcus, who slept heavily, claimed to hear nothing. Jake admitted to the sounds but attributed them to the building's age and the varying temperatures that cause different materials to expand and contract. I wanted to believe this explanation, but the precision troubled me. The sounds occurred at exactly the same time each week, in exactly the same sequence, with exactly the same intervals between each knock. Everything else might have remained manageable if not for the missing objects. It started small. My favorite coffee mug disappeared from the kitchen counter where I'd left it after washing. I searched the cabinets, checked our bedrooms, even looked in the refrigerator in case someone had played a prank. 3 days later, Marcus found me searching and asked what I was looking for. When I explained about the mug, he looked genuinely puzzled and suggested I might have absent-mindedly put it somewhere unusual. The next morning, I found the mug sitting exactly where I'd originally left it, clean and dry, as if it had never moved. Marcus lost his wallet the following week. He was certain he'd placed it on his dresser before going to sleep, but it was gone when he woke. We helped him search the entire house, checking between couch cushions, underbeds, inside jacket pockets. Nothing. Marcus was preparing to cancel his credit cards when Jake suggested, half-jokingly, that he should try asking for it back aloud. The suggestion seemed absurd, but Marcus was desperate enough to humor it. Standing in the center of the living room, he cleared his throat and spoke to the empty air, apologizing for any disrespect and asking for his wallet's return. I felt secondhand embarrassment watching him, but the next morning his wallet sat on the kitchen table, all contents intact. Jake was the most skeptical among us until he lost his keys. He'd been preparing to leave for work when he realized they weren't in his jacket pocket where he always kept them. Unlike Marcus's wallet situation, Jake had a spare set hidden outside, so the inconvenience was minimal. But his keys had a distinctive keychain, a small metal compass his grandfather had given him, and losing it bothered him more than he initially let on. For 3 days, he searched methodically, growing increasingly frustrated. On the 4th day, I found him standing in the hallway at 6 in the morning, speaking clearly to the walls about how sorry he was for any oversight and how much the keychain meant to him. His keys appeared on his bedroom windowsill that afternoon. The incidents should have brought us together, but instead, they created an undercurrent of tension. None of us wanted to acknowledge what seemed to be happening, yet we couldn't ignore the pattern. We began moving through the house more carefully, speaking in lower voices, treating our living space like a library, where unknown patrons demanded absolute respect for established rules. The household tasks began during our 4th week. I woke one Thursday morning to find yesterday's pile of dirty dishes completely clean and stacked neatly in the cabinets. My first thought was that Marcus or Jake had done them as a surprise, but both insisted they'd been too exhausted from work to tackle the kitchen. We stood around the spotless sink, trying to reconstruct the previous evening. I distinctly remembered leaving several plates crusted with dried pasta sauce, plus glasses with rings of dried milk at the bottom. Everything now gleamed as if professionally cleaned. The shower situation proved more unsettling. Marcus mentioned that hot water had been running when he'd gotten up to use the bathroom during the night. He'd assumed Jake was taking a late shower, but Jake had been asleep for hours. When it happened again the following week, I investigated personally. The bathroom door was closed, and I could hear water running at full pressure. Steam seeped from under the door, carrying the scent of an unfamiliar soap, something floral and old-fashioned, nothing like the products any of us used. I waited outside for 20 minutes, listening to the steady flow of water, before the sound stopped abruptly. When I opened the door moments later, the bathroom was dry, the mirror free of condensation, the air carrying no trace of steam or unusual fragrance. Mail became our strangest recurring mystery. Letters began appearing in our mailbox addressed to names none of us recognized, all bearing postmarks from 1970. The return addresses led to locations that no longer existed, businesses that had closed decades ago, apartment buildings that had been demolished and replaced. The letters themselves were sealed but felt thin, as if they contained only a single sheet of paper. Marcus suggested we forward them or mark them as undeliverable, but somehow we never got around to it. The letters accumulated on the kitchen counter, creating a small pile of correspondence from another era. The silence rule revealed itself gradually. We'd always been reasonably quiet after 10 o'clock, but we began noticing that any sound after that hour seemed amplified and somehow unwelcome. Footsteps on the hardwood floor sounded like thunder. Closing a cabinet door created a bang that reverberated through the walls. Even whispered conversations felt intrusive, as if we were disturbing people trying to sleep. We started communicating through gestures and text messages after 10, treating our own home like a place where we were guests rather than residents. None of us discussed the atmosphere directly, but we all felt it, the sensation of being observed, evaluated, judged. The house felt occupied in ways that went beyond our physical presence. Sometimes I caught myself glancing over my shoulder while cooking, certain someone was standing behind me. Other times I'd pause while reading, convinced I'd heard my name spoken softly from another room. Jake began spending most evenings at his girlfriend's place. Marcus started working later hours, claiming he was trying to impress his supervisor, though I suspected he simply preferred avoiding the house during the evening hours. My paranoia peaked during the 6th week. I'd been having trouble sleeping, partly due to stress from a new job, partly because every sound in the house seemed magnified at night. I'd find myself lying awake, cataloging each creak and groan, trying to distinguish between normal building sounds and something else. The Wednesday morning pattern had become as reliable as an alarm clock, but other sounds occurred throughout the week now. Soft footsteps in the hallway during the early morning hours, the gentle closing of cabinet doors, the occasional clink of dishware being arranged. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with my phone's flashlight, I crept from my bedroom toward the kitchen, following the sound of what seemed to be someone preparing a meal. The closer I got, the more distinct the sounds became. The soft scrape of a spatula against a pan, the bubble of something simmering, the delicate clink of plates being set on the counter. I could smell something cooking. Eggs, perhaps, with herbs I couldn't identify. The scents were rich and complex, the kind that came from someone who understood cooking as more than mere sustenance. At the kitchen threshold, I paused. The sounds continued, but I could see nothing unusual. The stovetop was cold and empty. No dishes sat on the counter. The air carried no trace of the cooking smells I detected moments before. Yet the sounds persisted for several more minutes before fading gradually, like a radio being slowly turned down. I stood in the dark kitchen for nearly an hour afterward, trying to process what I'd experienced. The logical explanations felt insufficient. Old pipes, settling wood, my own overwrought imagination. But the consistency troubled me. These weren't random noises. They followed patterns, suggested purpose, implied presence. The realization that changed everything came during my 7th week in the house. I'd been researching the building's history online, partly out of curiosity, partly hoping to find rational explanations for our experiences. Property records showed multiple ownership changes over the decades, with several periods where the house had remained vacant for extended periods. Newspaper archives revealed more troubling information. 3 separate incidents over the years where residents had taken their own lives due to financial difficulties. Each had died in a different room, one in the kitchen, one in the hallway, one in the upstairs bathroom. The dates corresponded roughly to periods when the house had been listed and then withdrawn from the rental market. But the most disturbing detail wasn't in the official records. It was in the classified ads I found from decades past. The same peculiar lease clause had appeared in rental listings for this address going back to the 1970s. Tenant agrees to respect the unlisted tenants and their established routines. The wording never varied, suggesting either decades of photocopying the same contract or something more intentional. I shared my findings with Marcus and Jake, expecting skepticism or rational explanations. Instead, both admitted they'd been having their own experiences, sounds they couldn't explain, sensations of being watched, the persistent feeling that we were sharing the space with others. Jake revealed he'd started leaving small offerings in the kitchen, cookies, pieces of fruit, which would disappear overnight. Marcus confessed that he'd begun speaking aloud to acknowledge whoever else might be present when he entered different rooms. We were adapting to cohabitation with residents we couldn't see. The final revelation came during our 8th week, on a Wednesday morning when the familiar pattern of knocks seemed more insistent than usual. This time Marcus and Jake both heard them clearly. We gathered in the living room afterward, trying to decide whether to address the situation directly or continue our tacit accommodation. Jake suggested we might try communicating more explicitly, asking questions aloud, establishing clear boundaries, perhaps even negotiating specific terms for sharing the space. As we talked, I noticed something that made my blood feel suddenly cold. The pile of 1970s mail on the kitchen counter had grown, but I now realized that some of the names on the envelopes matched names I'd found in the newspaper archives. The 3 residents who had died in the house were still receiving mail, 40 years later. But more disturbing was the letter I found on top of the pile, one that hadn't been there the night before. It was addressed to me, in handwriting I didn't recognize, with a current date and no postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. "Thank you for respecting our space. Your rent has been paid in silence. Please continue to honor our arrangement." I stared at the letter, my hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the paper stock and ink color matched the decades-old correspondence. The message suggested awareness of our presence, gratitude for our accommodation, and expectation of continued cooperation. Marcus and Jake read the letter over my shoulder, both silent for long moments. Finally, Jake asked the question we were all thinking: how could dead residents write letters? But as I looked around our kitchen, clean dishes we hadn't washed, the lingering scent of unfamiliar soap, the neat stack of mail from another era, I realized the question wasn't whether our housemates were dead. The question was whether we were still alive, or whether we'd become the unlisted tenants for someone else's lease agreement, signing our names to contracts we didn't understand in a house where time flowed differently, and the concept of permanent residency had become far more flexible than any of us had originally imagined. The letter was still in my hands when I noticed my signature at the bottom, in handwriting I couldn't remember making. Story 14. The Meridian Corporate Housing Complex squatted against the Indianapolis skyline like a concrete tumor, all sharp angles and tinted windows that reflected nothing but gray. When the company relocated me here for the quarterly audit, I should have known something was wrong by how quickly they'd found me accommodation. In a city where decent housing disappeared faster than free coffee in the break room, getting a furnished apartment within 24 hours felt less like luck and more like desperation on someone else's part. Nobody else wanted 4B, the property manager had mumbled, not quite meeting my eyes as he handed over the key card. His fingers trembled slightly, whether from caffeine or something else I couldn't tell. Previous tenant moved out suddenly, left most of his stuff behind. The apartment itself seemed normal enough at first glance. Beige walls, beige carpet, beige everything. Standard corporate housing fare designed to be inoffensively bland. The living room held a couch that had seen better decades and a coffee table scarred by countless coffee mugs. The kitchenette boasted appliances that hummed with that particular frequency of machines on their last legs. But it was the bedroom that felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint why initially. The closet dominated the far wall, an oversized wooden monstrosity with bifold doors that didn't quite align properly. Inside, a chrome rod stretched from wall to wall, supporting an army of wire hangers that the previous tenant had left behind. They hung there in perfect spacing, as if someone had arranged them with obsessive precision. The sight of them sent an inexplicable chill down my spine, like seeing a graveyard where all the headstones faced the wrong direction. That first night, I placed my work badge on the nightstand next to my wallet and phone, just as I had every night for the past 8 years. Routine was anchor, especially in unfamiliar places. The badge, a laminated rectangle bearing my photo and the company logo, caught the amber glow from the street lamp outside, its magnetic strip gleaming dully. Sleep came fitfully. The building settled around me with creaks and groans, the heating system cycling on and off with mechanical wheeze. Somewhere in the walls, pipes gurgled like digestive systems, but beneath these normal sounds lurked something else, a subtle rhythmic ticking that seemed to emanate from the closet. When I strained to listen, it stopped. When I relaxed, it resumed. just below the threshold of conscious awareness. At exactly 3:11 a.m., my eyes snapped open. The ticking had changed. It came now in deliberate patterns, short bursts followed by longer ones, with carefully measured pauses between. Dot dash dot, dash dot dash dash, dot dash dot dot. My sleep-fogged brain struggled to process what I was hearing until recognition hit like ice water in my veins. Morse code. The hangers in the closet were swaying in the darkness, their metal forms catching fragments of streetlight and casting writhing shadows across the walls. They moved with purpose, each oscillation producing a soft metallic chime that formed part of a larger pattern. I lay frozen, hardly breathing, as the sound spelled out letters with mechanical precision. M-I-L-L-E-R. My surname. My goddamn surname, tapped out by coat hangers in the dead of night. I told myself it was the building settling, thermal expansion causing the rod to shift and the hangers to sway. Old buildings did strange things. The Morse code pattern was coincidence, my pattern-seeking brain imposing meaning where none existed. But even as I rationalized, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The ticking stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt solid. I waited, muscles tensed, for it to resume. Minutes stretched past. Just as I began to relax, the closet door, which I was certain I'd left closed, stood slightly ajar. Fear rooted me to the mattress. The gap between the doors revealed only darkness, but it felt like being watched by an enormous eye. I should get up and check. I should close the door properly and investigate the source of the sounds. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head like a child and waited for dawn. Morning brought harsh fluorescent reality. In daylight, the closet looked perfectly normal, just another piece of cheap corporate furniture. The hangers hung motionless, spaced with that same unsettling precision. I checked the rod for looseness, but it held firm. No obvious explanation for the midnight symphony. My badge lay exactly where I'd left it on the nightstand. The second night, I positioned myself differently in bed, angling so I could watch the closet without appearing to do so. I even left the bathroom light on, its glow spilling into the bedroom just enough to illuminate the closet doors. If something was moving those hangers, I'd see it. 3:11 a.m. arrived with clockwork inevitability. The ticking began again, that same deliberate rhythm spelling out my name in the language of telegraphs and sinking ships. But this time I forced myself to watch. The hangers swayed in perfect synchronization, each movement producing its measured chime. No wind stirred them. No vibration from the heating system could account for their coordinated dance. They simply moved, as if guided by invisible hands or responding to some force beyond my comprehension. M-I-L-L-E-R. 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 The repetition took on an hypnotic quality, like a mantra or an incantation. I found myself counting the dots and dashes, my heartbeat gradually synchronizing with the rhythm. The fear began to ebb, replaced by a strange fascination. Whatever was happening felt less like a threat and more like an attempt at communication. When the performance ended, I waited for the door to drift open as it had the night before. Instead, something else happened. A soft thud came from inside the closet, as if something had fallen to the floor. This time, I got up. The hardwood felt ice cold against my bare feet as I approached the closet. The doors remained closed, but a thin seam of darkness between them seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I grasped the handles and slowly pulled them apart. My work badge hung from one of the middle hangers. I stared at it in disbelief, then turned to check the nightstand. Empty. My wallet and phone remained where I'd left them, but the badge was gone, transported somehow from beside my bed to inside the closet without my knowledge. The magnetic strip caught the bathroom light, winking at me like a knowing eye. Sleepwalking. That had to be it. The stress of the relocation, the unfamiliar environment, the audit pressure at work. All of it was manifesting in unconscious nighttime wandering. I'd moved the badge myself and simply couldn't remember doing it. The mind played strange tricks when pushed to its limits. I retrieved the badge and returned it to the nightstand, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. Instead, I lay awake, cataloging rational explanations for what I'd experienced. Building settling, unconscious movement, stress-induced hallucinations. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself. The third night, I took precautions. Before bed, I photographed the badge on the nightstand with my phone, time-stamped and everything. I wedged a chair against the bedroom door to prevent sleepwalking. I even set up my laptop to record the closet throughout the night, though the camera's night vision capability was limited. 3:11 a.m. brought the familiar ticking, but this time with variations. The basic pattern remained, my surname in Morse code, but now additional letters appeared in the pauses between repetitions. SOONTIMECOMING. Soon. Time. Coming. The words sent ice through my veins. Whatever intelligence guided those hangers was not content to simply announce my name. It was trying to tell me something, to warn me or threaten me. The distinction seemed increasingly irrelevant. When morning came, I checked the laptop recording first. The video showed nothing, just dark shapes that could have been hangers swaying, or could have been shadows shifting as clouds passed overhead. The audio picked up faint sounds that might have been ticking, or might have been the building's natural settling. Everything was frustratingly ambiguous. But my badge hung in the closet again, despite the chair barricade and my conscious efforts to stay awake all night. This time, it wasn't alone. My spare car keys dangled from a neighboring hanger, keys I'd last seen in my jacket pocket. A small notebook I kept for work notes hung by its spiral binding from another hook. Each item was carefully positioned, spaced with that same obsessive precision that characterized everything about the closet. I checked my phone. The time-stamped photo clearly showed all these items in their proper places just hours before. Yet here they were, relocated by some agency I couldn't fathom or remember. The fourth night changed everything. I'd spent the day at work in a fog of exhaustion and growing paranoia. Colleagues commented on my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at unexpected sounds. When my supervisor asked if I was feeling all right, I nearly laughed. How could I explain that my apartment was playing games with my possessions? That coat hangers were spelling out messages in Morse code? That I was either going insane or experiencing something beyond the boundaries of rational explanation? Instead, I mumbled something about adjusting to the new location and promised to get more sleep. That evening, I prepared for war. I moved every personal item into the living room: wallet, keys, phone, badge, even my clothes. If something wanted to relocate my possessions, it would have to work harder for the privilege. I barricaded the bedroom door from the inside and settled in to wait. 3:11 a.m. arrived with its punctual malevolence. The ticking began immediately, but the pattern was different now. Instead of my surname, the hanger spelled out something else entirely. YOURDATE, your date. Before I could process the meaning, I heard sounds from the living room. Soft shuffling movements, like someone carefully arranging objects. My blood turned to slush. Whatever force operated in this apartment wasn't confined to the closet. It had access to the entire space, and I'd just provided it with a buffet of my personal belongings. The bedroom door remained barricaded, but I could hear my possessions being moved around beyond it. Items being picked up and set down with deliberate care, drawers opening and closing, the soft whisper of paper being handled. The ticking from the closet continued throughout, providing an ominous soundtrack to whatever was happening in the living room. YOURDATE, YOURDATE. The repetition took on an urgency that made my skin crawl. When dawn finally broke, I moved the chair aside and ventured into the living room, with the caution of a soldier entering enemy territory. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Wallet on the coffee table, keys beside the couch, phone plugged into the charger. Nothing seemed disturbed, but when I returned to the bedroom, I found my badge hanging in the closet again, along with every other item I'd moved. Each piece bore a small white label, the kind produced by those handheld label makers' offices used for organization. The labels were pristine, their text printed in neat black letters. Badge 0715-2025, Keys 07/23/2025. Wallet 08/02/2025. Phone 08/14/2025. Dates in the future. Dates that wouldn't arrive for days or weeks. I stared at the labels until my eyes watered, trying to comprehend their meaning. The dates seemed random at first, but gradually a pattern emerged. They were spaced roughly 8 to 12 days apart, forming a sequence that stretched into August. A timeline of some kind. But for what? My hands shook as I removed the items from the closet and peeled off the labels. The adhesive came away cleanly, leaving no residue, as if the labels had been applied moments before. I crumpled them up and threw them in the trash, but the dates burned in my memory. Or 7/15/2025. Tomorrow. That night, the fifth night, I didn't go to bed at all. I sat in the living room with every light on, watching the bedroom doorway like a sentry. My laptop showed a continuous recording of the closet, and I'd positioned my phone to capture audio from multiple angles. If something was going to happen tomorrow, if that date meant anything significant, I would document every second of it. 3:11 a.m. came and went without the usual ticking. The silence felt more ominous than the sounds had been, like the pause before a predator strikes. I waited, muscles coiled with tension, for something to break the quiet. At 3:33 a.m., my work badge appeared in the closet again. I was watching the laptop screen when it happened. One moment the closet was empty except for the hangers, and the next moment my badge hung from the central hook as if it had always been there. No movement on the video, no transition, just instantaneous relocation that defied every law of physics I knew. My badge, which sat on the coffee table 3 feet away from me, remained exactly where I'd placed it. 2 identical badges, same photo, same magnetic strip, same subtle wear marks from months of daily use. I picked up both and compared them under the harsh living room lights. Perfect duplicates down to the smallest detail, except the one from the closet felt colder, as if it had been stored in a freezer. The implication hit me like a physical blow. If the entity, whatever it was, could duplicate my badge so perfectly, what else could it replicate? What else had it been practicing on during those previous nights? I thought about the dates on the labels. 07/15/2025. Today, now that it was past midnight. Was something supposed to happen today? Some significance to this particular date that I couldn't grasp? As if summoned by my thoughts, the ticking resumed from the closet. But the pattern was different now, more complex. Multiple sequences overlapping and interweaving, creating a symphony of metallic sounds that spelled out messages faster than I could decode them. READYNOWYOURTURN. Ready. Now. Your turn. The words echoed in my mind as I stared at the duplicate badge in my hand. Your turn for what? To join whatever game this entity was playing? To accept whatever fate those future dates represented? I looked at my phone, 3:47 a.m. on July 15th, 2025. In the closet, something new had appeared alongside my badge. A small white envelope hanging from a hanger by a single piece of tape. My name was written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Neat, precise letters that looked almost mechanical in their perfection. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper containing a list of dates and times, all in the future. Beside each entry was a brief description. 07/23/2025, 3:11 a.m., keys relocated. 08/02/2025, 3:11 a.m., wallet contents reorganized. 08/14/2025, 3:11 a.m., phone contacts updated. 08/26/2025, 3:11 a.m., new items introduced. 09/07/2025, 3:11 a.m., transition begins. 09/19/2025, 3:11 a.m., process complete. The paper shook in my hands as I read the final entry over and over. Process complete. Complete what process? What was supposed to happen to me over the next 2 months? I wanted to run, to pack my bags and demand different accommodation, to escape whatever fate this apartment had planned for me. But looking at the list again, I realized the futility of flight. These weren't predictions, they were a schedule. Events that would happen regardless of where I went or what I did. The entity wasn't confined to this apartment, it was connected to me somehow, drawn by some quality I possessed or action I'd taken. The duplicate badge in my hand grew colder, almost burning with its chill. I looked from it to the original on the coffee table, identical except for temperature. Which one was real? Which one was the copy? And if this entity could duplicate objects so perfectly, so completely, what did that mean for the larger pattern it was weaving? Outside, the first hints of dawn crept across the Indianapolis skyline, painting the corporate towers in shades of pink and gold. Another day was beginning, but I felt like I was standing at the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss that reflected my own face back at me. The ticking from the closet had stopped, but I could still feel its rhythm in my chest, synchronized with my heartbeat. M-I-L-L-E-R. 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 My name repeated endlessly in the language of ghosts and old machines, calling me toward a future I couldn't comprehend but could no longer avoid. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in my wallet. The real wallet, I hoped, though I was no longer certain I could tell the difference. The schedule would continue whether I participated willingly or not. The only question was whether I would face it with my eyes open or spend the next 2 months pretending that reality followed rules I understood. In the closet, the hangers hung motionless once more, but their silence felt temporary, a rest between movements in a symphony that was only just beginning. And somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, between sanity and madness, I began to suspect that the previous tenant hadn't moved out suddenly at all. He had simply reached the end of his own schedule.